Oh wait, I just realized, if I'm supposed to be Jonathan Joestar because that's the meme we're going with, according to that one interpretation from Biffweed, where Jonathan mistook Tanjiro for Digital Tai and demanded the Lex vs. Doom dissertation, or at least a Lex vs. Doom dissertation or something, given how I've already established that I took Kill Land for myself, and honestly, I might as well do the same with the Chaos Theater the moment I get out of here. But either way, going off of that interpretation, does this mean that I accidentally killed Digital Tai again?
No, by the way, here's your gauntlet back.
Well, thank you. Feels good to finally get out of there and be back to my old PNG self. Now, where was I? Oh yeah, Bill Cipher versus Discord. This was also one of my most wanted matchups, even before it got on the Champions poll, and even before I checked out Gravity Falls properly, might I add. But I just want to say that I only had one wish for the episode, and that was just for the Death Battle team to show me that they were having fun, and everything about this episode passed with flying colors, even in the analyses. Like, they all feel like they have the right amount of weird and quirky edits, but still give a lot of time to focus on the story. Specifically, the one thing that makes this matchup interesting: the contrast. I mean, it is pretty obvious with how they frame the ending of their stories, but the contrast is even highlighted in the ways that these analyses are edited. Bill's analysis has all sorts of weird edits, like the Schrodinger thing, as well as all sorts of video camera overlays and old-timey horror edits, and music that fits the tone to a T. Whereas in Discord's analysis, the music is more whimsical, and while Discord does mess with the footage from time to time, that's only when we actually see him talking on screen, like in the cutaway gag. Oh, and a shoutouts to the experience substantiation part where we cut to live action Wiz and Boomstick. That's just perfect. And Bill's cutaway gag was great too. I really like how fast Wiz says,
when I started talking to him.
It's one of those stop paying attention and you'll miss it type of jokes, where if it was drawn out at all, you would see the joke coming, but because he says it so fast, you don't immediately know that a joke is being told. And I also like how Boomstick just casually slaps Bill out of Wiz as if it's something he can do every day. And the fight? Well, what do you want me to say? This is good. This is funny. This is good. This is funny. This is good. This is funny. Like I said earlier, it's just non-stop fun from beginning to end. It's all I wanted it to be, and yet the animation still went beyond that. The animation actually adds more from the storyboards, which is kind of a rarity for Death Battle, where there's usually more content and better expressions in the storyboards when compared to the final animation, but here's the opposite, and I really like that. And that contrast I mentioned is so seamlessly integrated throughout basically the entire fight. Just take a look at one of my favorite examples of this.
You are not qualified to work with a fourth wall.
Discord's reactions and animations are much more zany, cartoony, fluid. Like, seriously, look at this movement. He moves so fucking fluid in this animation, and that's genuinely impressive. Even Death Battle's best sprite fights aren't usually this fluid. Meanwhile, Bill, while undoubtedly expressive and animated in an entertaining way, has comparatively more straightforward and realistic animations. Like, you can see the pain he's taking at all times. Dare I say, this could be referencing the fact that Bill is, tunnel visioned on killing Discord. Now that's clever. Yeah, because this animation is really clever, especially with the ending where it's revealed that Discord knew he was gonna go down, so he kind of spent the entire latter half of the fight, if not the entire fight itself, to freeing Equestria from Bill's clutches. And anyone with a sharp eye would be able to see it coming or notice that something was a little off. And I also like how those clues only start coming into play after the puppet dimension, referencing that one My Little Pony episode where Discord opens a portal to another puppet dimension. Like, seriously, I adore basically everything about this episode, except for the conclusion. Though I do need to clarify that it has nothing to do with the verdict on paper. I actually agree with Death Battle on accounts that Bill wins, and in terms of scaling, I do seem to be on the same wavelength as what the research team is presenting. Plus, a couple of people have clarified things to me, like Bill's tunnel vision and the context of the Starlight Glimmer clip, so those points, and by extension, Discord being more consistently carefree, make more sense to me. I just don't like the way they go about it. Even if I do understand why they approached it from a tertiary standpoint and chose to leave the stats to the sidebars. What a lot of people seem to be overlooking is that this fight is Trunks versus Silver levels of interpretation incarnate. In fact, I'd argue that interpretation is even more apparent for this matchup, because with Trunks versus Silver, as complex as it was, a lot of it's essentially boiled down to how you interpreted their series' cosmologies. Whereas here, not only did you have to do that, but you also had to interpret their power sets, the limits to said power sets, and it's just all over the place, really. Plus, given how I feel so hyper-fixated on the cosmologies of two cartoon series, then I gotta go do the one thing that you're never gonna see a Death Battle hater doing. Wow, it's that easy. But it still has some issues that I cannot wrap my head around. Granted, some of it does go into outside factors, so I'm obviously not going to go into all of them, but let's just put that aside for a second and focus on the arguments that Death Battle is bringing in the episode itself. Why is the Chactron's magic nullifying barrier being directly compared to the magic absorbing bewitching bell? How is Tyrek in any way comparable to Bill in terms of their trickery? And if Discord did have the means to recreate Bill's quote-unquote death, which they say Bill would not be able to come back from fast enough to resume the fight, what exactly was stopping Discord from doing that? Why are you saying that the fight was almost dead even, only to just outright say that Discord was less powerful than Bill? Like, pick one. I've said this before, you can make whatever argument you want. Just be consistent. And if you really need to, add an extra minute or context or something. But don't let this distract you from the fact that this episode was fantastic. It's got fun analyses, fun animation, and a fun track in that of Discord and Cipher that, I will admit, does feel a little too Gravity Falls coded. And no, I don't feel like adding references to a fan-made song is enough to represent the other side of the matchup, especially since they reference the Living Tombstone version instead of the good version. Wait, that wasn't in the script. But I really do like the lyrics and how it feels more like a musical theater piece, with some EDM music thrown in there. But it's just that conclusion, man. I think it has too many problems for me to consider this my favorite of the season. Although I will give shoutouts to how the tunnel vision they bring up in said conclusion is technically played as a factor in the animation, where he was tunnel visioned on killing Discord that he didn't even notice he was losing control of Equestria. But this episode is in line with episodes with this genre of problem, like Ryu vs. Jin, Ganondorf vs. Dracula, and what I should have pointed out for Iron Man vs. Lex Luthor, but I completely missed the fact that the verdict is technically wrong by the episode's logic. Oops. So because of that, I'm giving this episode a 97 out of 100. Sorry to burst the bubble of anyone who thought this was going to be my second favorite of the season, but let's just say there is a hand-drawn episode that I think is more deserving of that title. But we'll get there when we get there. Until then, let's talk about the other winner of the Champions Poll. Can we get a W for Hyper Starman in the chat, guys? I like how this season had a bit of a theme where both halves started with 2 that we knew were happening and 6 that we didn't know were happening until they got announced. But otherwise, I have a bit of a bone to pick with how people have gone about criticizing this episode. Not to say that their criticisms are invalid, but it's just the way that they feel presented to me pisses me off in a way. Let me explain. A lot of people have prevented themselves from ranking this in the top half of their season 10 rankings. I know some people who outright dislike this episode, and it's almost entirely because of the analyses. And speaking as the guy who's been preaching that Death Battle analyses are far more important than the community has generally been giving them credit for, you'd think I'd be at least a little bit happy to see it. But no, I think that the reactions to the analyses in Cole vs. Alex are overblown, to a point where I've seen way too many people say that it borders on insulting. Really? With all due respect, who's the insult directed towards? Infamous fans? Sorry for not feeling sorry, but I don't see it. Prototype fans? No, because Alex actually got a much better analysis than Cole, as I'll be getting to in a bit. Fans of the matchup? I mean, I guess the prelude you can make a case for, but doing so would just be outright misinterpreting the joke, where it takes place within a 2013 script, where people have said that it's insulting to fans of classic Death Battle. And speaking as one of those fans, not even 0.5% close. Granted, it's not an accurate depiction of that time period, but insulting? Really? The worst you can say is that it has cringy humor, because as we all know, Death Battle's never had cringy humor at any point in the history of ever, right? Certainly not in the 2013 era. Plus, I'd argue that the jokes aren't even that bad. None of them are good, mind you, but at least they're short. They get to the point. They don't overstay their welcome for 1,000 years. It's because of that reason that I'd argue that the fart joke from Blake vs. Mikasa is infinitely cringier than any and every joke from Cole vs. Alex combined. But what really bothers me is that the analyses never weighed their opinions this heavily ever again. Not in episodes that followed this, not in episodes that premiered before this, and I especially don't understand why we can never seem to have the inverse, where an amazingly written pair of analyses can help elevate an otherwise less than stellar fight scene. Or maybe there's a fifth angle I'm overlooking, but with all due respect, I have no idea where the insult is coming from, and I can't help but believe that this claim is coming from the Death Battle community yet again looking far too deep into things. But with all of that said, in my Gus vs. Dimitri video, which I'm pretty sure you haven't watched for some reason, and if you have, watch it again, I refer to the analyses as underwhelmingly written. That's gonna take another bit of a tangent to explain. Do you want to know why this rivalry was a thing to begin with? Well, there's several reasons actually, but one big reason, at least from my perspective, these two games were practically defined by their morality systems. And giving their differing paths, this would have been a perfect opportunity to truly dissect it and what it meant for their games. But it wasn't. Even if they cover their stories, they don't exactly go into the decisions they had to make, the tough ones or the easy ones. A lot of it is just skimmed over for respect thread boogaloo, and that's just not fun nor interesting. And even the jokes kind of disappoint me. Even if I don't find them that bad, they do have another issue that I haven't quite seen get talked about nearly as often. Like, I'll give some points to Dragonborn's analysis, because even if I didn't find any of the jokes funny, at least the jokes exclusively consisted of things that you would hear Elder Scrolls fans laughing about. You know, like the game's spaghetti code, or how easy it is to exploit, or acknowledging the existence of Sheogorath, or cheese for everyone! Meanwhile, with Cole vs. Alex, can you name a single person in the history of ever that has regularly made arbitrary comparisons to Shadow the Hedgehog, or Goku's muffin button? A lot of the humor is very referential, mainly focusing on jokes that you would generally hear during that time period, rather than jokes that you would hear Infamous or Prototype fans making. Except for the closest being where they quote the fucking weird fucking rambling shit. But like, is that a meme? Boomstick announces it as if it's a meme, but is it really? I don't know. I don't play these games, yet as a Death Battle tuber, I'm gonna gaslight people into thinking that I have. But now onto a proper critique of the analyses. With Cole's analysis, there's a siren going on at 1 a.m.? Okay, sure. With Cole's analysis, how in the living mother of are you going to talk about Cole's storyline and at no point name drop Zeke or Trish? Look, even as an outsider, I know who these characters are and what role they play in Cole's story specifically. They name drop Kessler without any issue. Why not his best friend and his future wife, or kind of future wife? I'm trying so hard not to spoil these games. Another siren. We just had one! Again, a lot of this is just a respect thread. Who finds this interesting aside from me? Because I've said that I can enjoy, or at least find some enjoyment from analyses that heavily focus on power sets, but this analysis is very obviously not one of those moments, so see, Death Battle, hire me. I can drop forced body humor too, you know. And then there's the cutaway gag where they have Evil Boomstick. This is actually a fantastic setup for a joke that's supposed to represent an old script from 2013. We have Evil Boomstick representing how edgy he was back in the day. Obsessed with explosions, gave no shits about the character. Even going as far as to directly say Evil Cole is objectively better than Good Cole just because of how much destruction he can cause. And Normal Boomstick is clearly not having it. But then Evil Boomstick explodes, and then Normal Boomstick says,
"Well, that just happened. Who wrote this?"
Pretty sure the MCU did this joke funny. Alex's analysis, as I mentioned earlier, it is better. It still does have the same issues that plagued Cole's analysis, but not nearly as much, and they're exclusively in the first half. Here we get a lot more emphasis on things like the Blacklight virus and what it was revealed to have been. Although I will say I do like the Linkin Park joke because it displays how times have changed since those early seasons, where you straight up cannot get away with adding Linkin Park music to your videos without getting a copyright strike. Although it does have yet another cutaway gag that tries to set up a good joke, but ends up going nowhere. At least Evil Boomstick got to annoy Normal Boomstick. Why would you even make an Evil Wiz if he wasn't even gonna do anything? But this does lead into the second half of Alex's rundown, where it gets a lot better. Going over how he became a villain, describing James Heller's role in taking Alex down, and even Boomstick's ending monologue on the day that Alex became human. It's actually a really cool note to end off on. Oh, and there's also the part where Wiz says, "That's right, Boomstick," so you know it's peak. weak. And I also like how nonchalantly he says it, as if he's basically telling Boomstick, yeah, we get it. Though I can understand why people won't say that it's enough to save the analyses generally. But if you think that the fight is anything like these, you got another thing coming. Because I'd argue that this fight is fundamentally flawless in the exact same way that classic Death Battle's all-time best were fundamentally flawless, while also being everything that the analyses should have been, even if they removed the funny scream. I mean, I guess that the soft piano music doesn't quite fit the action that's going on at the start, and there is the one stiff animation of Alex removing the helicopter door, as well as getting zapped by Cole, and the models do look really weird, but much like with Chosen Born, these are old models being animated in an engine that they likely weren't made with in mind, so there's no reason to be too harsh on them. But other than that, this fight is phenomenal, no way around it. Like, there's this shot where Alex is sending out his tendrils, and then they work in Cole's induction grind by having him skate down the tendrils. And there are also plenty of other animations that look snappy for the right reasons, and some shots that just straight up make me forget that this is an animation. Take a look at this shot where Cole throws Alex. I mean, even the aftermath looks a little weak if you look at it close enough. The actual start of it looks amazing. Look at this camera tracking, focusing on Cole's body that creates a lot of velocity as he spins around Alex. Or how about this fight where Alex's tendril is moving towards Cole and the camera zooms out from Alex's body as his tendril is moving forward. Or how he uses his Blanca Ball technique as he pops out of the smoke. These aren't super complex scenes, but they just feel cinematic solely because of how well they're executed. And the general fight dynamic is really interesting, with Cole getting the upper hand when he gets to use more of his far-range abilities, but Alex gets the upper hand when they're fighting in close quarters. And then you get to the office scene, which has some impeccable lighting. It's dark, it's chilling, and you can even hear the screams of some civilians if you really listen closely. And this is apparently why he uses his ice abilities, as they're the only powers he has that aren't lethal to normal civilians, at least in normal gameplay. And they even added a fog to help accentuate the atmosphere.
What a nightmare. You don't know the half of it.
Okay, I'll fully admit that I thought Alex was saying both lines, but that's just my fault. Though this exchange is likely referencing how Cole reacts to seeing what the blacklight virus can do to a person, and Alex is referencing how he's been there himself, and this form right here is where it led him. Although yes, Cole kinda did deserve to get his shit kicked in, because, buddy, why are you standing here? And then Cole does this tornado, which looks really, really good with the stylized 2D effects. They're prevalent throughout the whole animation, but it's right here where it really starts to feel unique. But then there's this next part, the climax, which, while the analyses sadly did nothing with the great power comes great responsibility reference, the fight's climax is supposedly an homage to the Spider-Man and Green Goblin conversation from the first Sam Raimi movie, where Alex is giving him one of those you and I are not so different moments, but Cole outright rejects his proposal and then begins one of, if not the most chilling moment in the entire show for me, only being rivaled by the opening of the 8th gate in All Might vs. Might Guy.
So much power, and yet you waste it on these vermin. You and I can change this world for the better. The only vermin I see here is you.
The lightning effects, and even the music, where the chord change from the track makes a breathtaking, no, word-taking moment as he forms his gigawatt blaze and walks slowly just as the lyrics say, "It's just me," and then cuts to Alex as he says, "It's just me," stating how they're on their last legs, they've escalated the fight as high as they can get, and there's only one person in front of them. Aside from this silly-looking rapid punch from Cole, this fight sequence goes hard, once again emphasizing that dynamic, where Cole has to rely on using his speed to sufficiently knock Alex back. Alex is able to knock him away with a single punch, and then they fly into the air with a thought-taking shot like And finally, Cole uses his bioelectricity to break through Alex's tendrils and leech it onto Alex, who is completely unable to handle any of it. And then it brings the fight back to where it all began after taking the fight to higher and higher locations, peeking at the sky, and then going back to normal ground level. And then Cole disintegrates the last piece of Alex, preventing him from regenerating, as he gives one last line that, speaking as someone who's never played one of their games, feels perfectly in character for both. But then there's the track, Inhuman. I'm just gonna say it, this is my favorite track of the entire show. That's right, braggers. Fight Like a Devil has been dethroned. Now we're in the Inhuman Zone. This is yet another rap battle track, but it's done with such a unique take where the lyrics are conveyed as Cole pumping himself up and Alex trying to tear him down. And the instrumental is just impeccable. It's such a perfect genre blend of hip-hop and classical string music. And the lyrics even give a subtle reference to Delson and Heller respectively. And that's to say nothing of the dump trucks worth of references that you'll be able to find if you want to do some deeper digging. And just generally, this track is worthy of the Jonathan Frostathan 2018 combo video montage, and you know it. I don't expect to change the minds of anyone who felt that the analyses kind of ruined the episode for them in a way, as they really couldn't live up to all of this, but even still, it is all of this. 86 out of 100. This episode sure as hell isn't perfect, but it's a lot better without your cynicism, asshole. And yeah, now that's pretty much every single episode we knew about. So these next 6 episodes were up in the air. Let's see what they decided to follow this up with.
Oh no! No! Oh no!
Yeah, in case you couldn't tell by that reaction, I knew going in that this was going to be Season 10's canon event. I guess I should have brought up the canon event for other seasons, though in case you're curious, here you go. Pause to read if you feel like it, because if you don't, it's gonna get cut off by the start of the next sentence. Talks of Frieza versus Megatron have been so much more hostile compared to every other episode from this season, aside from Bill Cipher versus Discord, because why do you think? But this one is absolutely the case for people who are generally outside of the death battle community, where people insist that, oh, hey, it's the bot, I gotta get that out of here. And even on the other side, people say that Frieza should have stomped harder. If you don't go in passionately criticizing this, you are a fanboy. That's a nice point you're making there, but here's the thing. I mock those people on a regular basis, and I guess I can understand if people are tired of me doing this. So let me be real with you. While I do like to make fun of criticisms I personally find unreasonable or ridiculous, if I can understand where a complaint is coming from, or if I think that it can elicit some interesting conversations, I'm more than willing to frame it in the light of respect it needs to be in, or at the very least I can give it the benefit of the doubt. And truth be told, there's a lot to talk about with Frieza versus Megatron. Dare I say, more than every single episode that I haven't given a fully scripted rundown for. And a lot of it dates back to before the episode was even planned, where there was a time where this was the G1 team's most wanted matchup. Even if that had to do with Frieza not having much better, or with Megatron not having much better, eventually something happened.
Dude, check the news. It doesn't matter what channel.
I personally dislike Frieza versus Megatron as a matchup.
Though, I do want to clarify that I am not blaming Nemesis Bloodreich for any of this. I believe that doing so would be irresponsible, stupid, and completely dismissive of the real issue at play here. And it's one that I'm sure you've seen happen before, where a video that goes over an unpopular opinion happens to go viral, at least within a certain community. And you got people just blindly shoving that video in everybody's face, or telling other people to go watch it even if they never asked for it. This video especially started popping up during the waiting period. But this episode almost happened around the same year that Nem's video was released, as it was planned for Season 8, but it needed to be delayed, and we got Goku Black versus Reverse Flash instead. Though in case you want to hear my thoughts on the matchup, I don't like it. It has a pretty nifty contrast, but at the end of the day, they sure are tyrants, and they have a rival, I guess. But when the episode got announced, something else came into play. This is where Death Battle stopped releasing episodes a day early for first members. It doesn't take too long to explain. This act was apparently significantly hurting their YouTube impressions, which meant that YouTube was just not having these videos pop up in other people's feeds, which I know is hard to believe given that damn near every episode from Season 10 made the trending page. But then you look at the relatively stagnant view count, at least in comparison to the types of views you would normally see Death Battle episodes getting, and well, this definitely paid off. Look at that view count. But then the episode released, and
You blithering punks!
There were quite a few people who took issue with the research, specifically on Megatron's side of things, although I do think there might be some context to this. So Death Battle has historically been criticized for fully compositing one character, while consciously choosing not to do the same for the other, or at the very least compositing the winner to a much more unfair degree. But Season 10 has stemmed another criticism, where people are getting mad at Death Battle for supposedly limiting one character, instead of fully compositing said character just for the sake of making the fight more fair.
You just asked for specifically that.
Okay, memes aside, I think I can pin down what this criticism is actually trying to say. I was made aware that in Prime vs. Gundam, Prime apparently was fully composited in terms of feats, and yet Amuro was heavily restricted, apparently not even being allowed to use his strongest robot. Given how Dragon Ball was generally one timeline, at least according to how the research team handled Dragon Ball back in the time period of Season 8, but here's the thing. They still kind of said that Megatron was supposed to be a G1 composite, yet in the episode, they say that they were heavily focusing on the 80s cartoon and the IDW comics, but will use other sources that don't seem contradictory. What do you mean by that? Thankfully, there is some more context that you can find in Ultra God's Death Battle retrospective, which he worked on after I uploaded my Season 9 ranking video, but he did say that Japanese G1, which for those who don't know was pretty much the crux of the argument for people believing that Megatron won, was excluded for a variety of reasons, but the big one was that he wanted to keep it civil among the research team. And he also had to deal with a bunch of other people who had no social awareness to speak of, and it also compelled them to stop doing public Q&As for Death Battle episodes. Okay, fair enough. But my question is, if this was supposed to be a G1 composite of Megatron, and if Japanese G1 was excluded, what about Beast Wars, or any of the other G1 continuities? Were those excluded? And if the answer is no, then where were they in the video? And another thing, when he talked about Zuko versus Shoto, he confirmed that the episode originally slated Zuko to winning, but then the episode got delayed, and one of the researchers did a recalc on one of Shoto's feats, and that's what allowed Shoto to get the W. In other words, we were super close to getting a modern Death Battle equivalent of Gata versus Toph, and I do not want to live in that timeline. But I do gotta ask, since this episode was originally slated for Season 8 and then got pushed back by 2 full seasons, I would like to ask if there are any double or triple checks made for the Transformers research side of things, or maybe if Megatron was originally planned to win, but they found something that moved them to give Frieza the W. Though, don't actually harass people over this. I'm only asking this out of honest curiosity. I don't actually care about this debate much. I only care about the quality of the episode, so let's just talk about that right now. Frieza's analysis, it was boring, but I do appreciate how they covered the reason behind Frieza's creation and what he was supposed to be a reflection of. And then there was a, just like real estate speculators gag, with Wiz's bit being a clear-cut reference, and Boomstick's bit being an exaggeration where you're like, I don't think so, but okay, that's fair. And then they start talking about his fight with Goku, where they begin to talk about some feats he accomplished that are completely unrelated to Goku. And then they go into his Golden Frieza form. Why was this not brought up before his feats? I don't know. That's just weird pacing to me. And then we get into Megatron's rundown, where the first third of it has some painfully unfunny jokes. Like, more like Optimus Prime. That had me cringing harder than anything in Cole vs. Alex, by the way. And I also found the toy robot running gag really annoying. I mean, it does stop partway through, but they never did this in Optimus Prime's analysis, or even Starscream's analysis for that matter. So like, why are they doing this for Megatron, who's like the most iconic big bad of Transformers? And the second third was mainly just white respect thread noise. Though I never thought I'd get to hear the word Nina tons again, but then we get to the final third, and I'll admit, it's some really good stuff. They mention his volatile rivalry with Optimus Prime and cover the time where he realized the error of his ways, rediscovered his peaceful aspirations, and even saved the universe as an Autobot, which was given a lot of emphasis with the music quieting down beforehand to give room for Wiz to passionately elaborate on how his philosophy changed. Though I do think that the ending note was a little rushed, and I kind of wish that Boomstick ended with the more than meets the eye line, but I really liked Wiz's delivery in the end, so I guess I can ignore that. I'd also want to give shoutouts to the editing sides of things, only because it's worth noting that Nick Kramer was the editor for this episode, barring some edits that DJ needed to finalize an ad following Nick's leave. And the fights, well, this was the first time Devil Devil Artemis animated an episode in Blender instead of SFM. And right off the bat, this adds a lot of visual flair to the fight. Not just with the wonderfully rendered models in VFX, where I'm pretty sure Frieza's model in particular was custom made, or at least I can't really find anything similar to it, but also with the way that shots are framed with various zoom blurs and even some RGB splits. It especially enhances Megatron's close-up with the antimatter, and I like how the setup demonstrates that contrast I mentioned. But there is one reoccurring issue that I'm sure you've heard before, it's the pacing. Though I don't think it's messy in the ways that you might think. Like for instance, I actually don't mind the Golden Frieza transformation. Does it go on for too long? Sure. But I also think it's really cool how DA chose to make it accurate to the one from the Dragon Ball Super anime by having Frieza snap into the transformation. The effects are really simple, but they just work for me. Rather, I'm talking about moments where shots will go from being very slow to very fast and abrupt and then to very slow again with no consistency. Let's take a look at Frieza's first rushdown. Like, there's way more time dedicated to the shot of Frieza flying towards Megatron than there is of him blitzing Megatron. And then there's this bit where Frieza is firing rapid lasers from his finger, but he charges it up like it's a single beam. I feel like this could have been a fault of the speed lines being too opaque, so toning down their opacity or repositioning them would have fixed it. Or, if nothing else, make the shots come out at slower intervals. Or maybe they could have added another line for Frieza like, "Is that so? Then I shall put those wits to the test." I feel like there's a reason for this with the differences in speed and pacing between Dragon Ball fights and Transformers fights, and DA probably wanted to do that as a means of balancing it out, but it doesn't work for reasons that I'll go into later. It does in a couple of ways. Like, I really like the multiple shots of Cybertron taking more and more damage with each cut, but then we get to this moment where Frieza does that thing from He-Man vs. Lion-O where he blasts Megatron away and then immediately says, "Where did he go?" Okay, I know that he at least teleports to the location, but it still feels weird to me. And then there's this shot of the tank, which first of all, I'm pretty sure is breaking the 180 rule. And second of all, it has Megatron taking way too long to charge up a single shot, which is not how it works in the clips that they show in the analysis. I also don't like the camera work here, at least in the beginning, where there's this shaky cam during moments of quick combat and dashes from a Frieza that you can barely see because of how small he is. Like, even in Jason vs. Michael, you could at least see the characters perfectly fine, though I wouldn't say that Devil Artemis is using shaky cam poorly. He does do it very well in moments like this stupid yet amazing moment of Megatron blasting himself upwards with the tank, transforming into his normal form, and using his gun to shoot at Frieza's death ball. It's just a really cool shot. But the camera work has other issues, like with this part where Frieza dodges the mace and dashes around some cannon shots. These shots and Frieza's aura are the exact same color, which makes it tough to notice Frieza getting hit. Personally, I would have just changed the color of Megatron's shots, like how Misaka's lightning abilities had their color changed for visual clarity, but I can also understand if Death Battle wanted to avoid that discrepancy again. So here I would have either changed the shot, something more akin to a first-person shot of Megatron shooting Frieza, or added a scene of Megatron finding the hit he needs and follow it up with another shot of Frieza getting hit. And there's also this punch from Frieza. While the framing is mostly fine, the punch itself doesn't linger for very long and seems to focus on the anticipation and recoil far more than the actual attack. And the inferior pacing from the final animation means that the otherwise amazing track, Final Formers, has a tempo that's too different from the speed of the fight. Albeit I wouldn't say it's as big of a problem as in Ghost Rider vs. Lobo, for instance, because here they do have a section with a slower drum beat that does match what's happening, and the "Why Won't You Die" verse playing as Cybertron explodes is such a good fit. But this does lead into another issue I have. Supposedly the intent of Final Formers was to be a companion piece to Wings of Iron, but the thing is, Final Formers does not feel like a companion piece to Wings of Iron. Its musical style feels way more Dragon Ball coded than Transformers to me. Like, yes, Transformers can have fast-paced music, like with Megatron's theme from Transformers Devastation, but it's heavier than the symphonic rock music you hear in Dragon Ball soundtracks and, Final Formers. Even if I still generally don't care for most of their music, I do feel like Sky's take on the track is a lot better at feeling like a sister track, using motifs that are similar but still mostly distinct from Wings of Iron, but changing the context of the lyrics to come across more villainous. Though what I do find interesting is that the storyboards not only fix the pacing issues I have, but they also reveal some cut bits of choreography that I would have loved to have seen remain in the final product. Like Frieza's minion Apul clarifies Cybertron's name for him. I do think that the final episode does it better, where it's implied that he just doesn't care about the name, but by the end of the animation, he's forced to not only remember but respect Cybertron and the people who inhabited it. And then Megatron has this line, which likely explains why the shot of Megatron firing at the giant fireball lingered for too long. Probably would have been necessary to include. And then there's Frieza's first rush down on Megatron, which is longer than it is in the fight, but in a good way. Instead of whiffing once and getting 2 attacks instantly and then taunting, the pattern is whiff, hit, brief posture, whiff, hit, taunt. Not only does it improve the pacing, but it also better communicates the episode's argument of Frieza being faster. And then there's also some content that was cut for the panic bubble scene, where there's this beatdown from Megatron where he not only punches Frieza, but also grabs hold of him and drags his face across the edge of the panic bubble before yeeting him out of the panic bubble and back onto Cybertron. Unlike in the final cut where he gets a single punch and then decides to just let Frieza fly out of it. Okay. And then the part where Megatron uses his mace is slightly extended, where Frieza firing multiple quick beams is way clearer. And then when Megatron throws his mace, Frieza gets hit by it as opposed to slowly dodging it. Though this scene where Megatron starts rapidly firing at Frieza was not in the storyboards, which makes me think was a means of compensating for the removed fight sequences since Megatron didn't get many other successful hits before this point. It is pretty basic, but it's necessary for a more engaging animation. Like, seriously, I'm pretty sure that there hasn't been a single Dragon Ball fight where the more powerful character one-shot, so I don't know why Dragon Ball fans would unironically complain about Frieza not one-shotting Megatron, but I digress. And then there's this part where instead of Frieza trapping Megatron in his imprisonment ball, Frieza was meant to catch Megatron's mace and use it to swing him around, then firing one powerful beam for good measure. The tank sequences also had Frieza maneuvering around its cannon with some really fluid motion before impulsively preparing a death saucer that causes him to get shot at point-blank range. And that's what leads into the Golden Frieza transformation. But in the episode, he attempts to block the tank shot, and it isn't nearly as cool and is also really slow. And the expression for when Frieza pulls the planet towards Megatron is obviously better, but that's mainly a storyboard thing, and I'm not sure if Frieza's model would be able to live up to that expression. And then the next part, where after Megatron lashes out at Frieza over his planet's destruction, we get another martial arts section, this time with Frieza casually no-selling Megatron's massive punch and snaring him in his imprisonment ball and walloping him until Megatron breaks out and they have the I-beam clash where Frieza manages to break Megatron's eyes and kicks him away, which leads into Megatron's monologue. I think that the episode makes the transition feel more natural, but I ultimately prefer how the storyboards contextualize the antimatter. And Megatron's monologue also has this unused line about how his planet used to be beautiful. It's kind of superfluous. Though the storyboards also take a W in how Frieza actually tries avoiding the antimatter instead of just staying still for some reason. With the some reason in question being that the episode seemed to have gone with a different interpretation where the antimatter was surrounding Frieza to a point where he had no means of escaping it. And finally, the storyboards add to the death where Frieza uses a death saucer to cut off Megatron's cannon arm and then summons way more to cut both Megatron and Cybertron to pieces. So yeah, this is probably the most amount of storyboard content you'll see cut, altered, changed, or adjusted in any Death Battle episode. But thankfully, the final product still has some really cool stuff. Like that part where Frieza counters Megatron's beam by pulling the planet towards his death ball, and by extension Megatron, causing it to explode. That's a really cool bit of choreography. And then we get to the climax, where Megatron spites Frieza by glazing the coldest monologue he could have given, saying that his conquest was pointless because Frieza lost his means of conquering more planets. And the antimatter itself gives off this buzzing sound, and it's so cool, especially with how it all looks. Like, look at it. And now, Frieza is left with half of his body, which makes Frieza insist on causing genocide on all Cybertronians, mainly out of fear for how powerful they could be. But there's still a bit of a caveat, and I do not agree with the consensus that this screwed Frieza over very much, especially not in the same way that Bill got screwed over. Like, keep in mind, Bill Cipher basically had the entire My Little Pony franchise, barring Discord, right under his fingertips, and Discord not only took it all away from him, but locked him back in his prison and laughed at him for it. And even when Bill tried to call out to the viewer one last time, it's heavily implied that the viewer ignored him. And even the people who jokingly said, "Lol, yes, I could make a deal with you," Bill was unable to hear any of it. Whereas with Frieza, the most he'd have to worry about is getting a new bottom half of his body, and given that his army is also destroyed, it might be harder than normal, but it's still nothing he hasn't done before. I mean, he could still destroy a planet with half of his body, so I can't imagine he'd be that depowered. Although I will say that something interesting is that this is the first time since Saitama vs. Popeye where there's planetary destruction. Just let that sink in. But then we get to the conclusion, and it has some pretty major issues in terms of presentation. I've already mentioned the lack of clarity in how they composite Megatron, but then there's also this moment right here.
The antimatter wasn't a surefire win. It would have to completely cover Frieza's whole body before he could react, and Frieza was way too fast for that.
Well, what would you call this then? Though yes, they do have a black box that says how he could just resist the antimatter, but like, which is it? Pick one. Truth be told, I really wish I could be more optimistic towards this episode, as I feel like Devil Artemis has been done kinda dirty these past couple of years. There have been quite a few people that have randomly felt like taking the piss out of his animations for one reason, the lamest genre of reasons, or...
See, I look at Death Battle solely for entertainment nowadays.
1 week later.
They were really trying to make it seem like their speed was even. Asta is blitzing this man. To me, this was straight one-sided.
Basically for no reason whatsoever. And yet the highest I can give this episode is a 65 out of 100. I think that the research being presented better would have come a long way, especially in the conclusion, and if the pacing issues were cleaned up, and maybe if all of those storyboard changes were added, or at least if some of them were, I could have really fallen in love with this episode in the same way that other people have. But hey, I still think it's a very memorable episode, and at least I gave real criticism, so stop it. Save the high and mighty crap for when you actually have something worth being high and mighty over. Let's just move on. Well, I didn't expect this one to happen so soon. Or at the very least, I would have expected Yuji versus Denji to happen first. But honestly, we got a matchup that's actually good. Wait, who said that? That, and it's nice to see more modern animanga series getting represented on Death Battle. And it's even more surprising that we now have 2 characters from Jujutsu Kaisen getting on the show before Yuji. Based. Though being transparent with my work process, given how unnecessarily long this retrospective has been taking me, I was able to watch the first season of Jujutsu Kaisen after I finished plotting down all the notes I needed to for this episode, with this episode being the most recent one I revisited for this ranking retrospective. In part because this is probably the one where I've had the most constantly shifting opinion on. It used to be in my top half, it used to be in my bottom 5 because I didn't find it that interesting. It used to be somewhere around the middle. It was just all over the place. But now that I've finally gotten a feel for this episode, enough time has passed. Gojo's analysis has a pretty deep dive on his powers. Things like his curse magic, the domain expansion, you get the idea. Clearly it's one of those analyses that focuses on his power sets, but there's one key difference that it has compared with all the other analyses of this ilk. It's worse than Cole's and Alex's analyses in every conceivable way. They say almost nothing about his character, and given that this is the debut of a new series in season 10, that's not a good look. And I know that Jujutsu Kaisen has very complex powers. A lot of people really care about his powers to the point where it's the only thing people regularly talk about when discussing Jujutsu Kaisen, and then somehow they blame Death Battle for not caring about the characters. But here's the thing, they are tied to each character's personalities, with Gojo especially being one of those cases. So this would have been the analysis where you needed to have a solid balance of both, even if you were ultimately going to cater more towards his power sets. I like Gojo because of his role in the series. He's a very interesting character in his own way. So to see nothing about what I liked about him covered, yeah, Cole and Alex have better analyses. Don't at me or at me. You only boo me because you're afraid to admit that I'm right. Say what you will about the analyses, but Alex's analysis at least added a compelling spiel about his downfall, and Cole's analysis at least had mostly adequate coverage of Kessler, the Beast, and his sacrifice. Unfitting royalty-free music notwithstanding. But Gojo? Nah, he gets nothing aside from a vague mention of Geto. And the explanation of his friendship with Geto radiates the exact same energy as when they brought up Yuno and Asta's analysis. It's good to see, but there was nothing that built it up, so it feels like it was here out of obligation rather than because the writers wanted it here. Yes, they directly say his philosophy changed, but like, how? And you want to know something else? Despite being arguably the main connection with this matchup, at no point do they mention his mentorship with Yuji. Hell, Yuji doesn't even get a name drop in this episode, which is such a bizarre omission, and I'm thoroughly surprised that no one else has brought this up. Like, you'd think they'd cover the main character of Jujutsu Kaisen, given that he's probably the most central character to Gojo's story specifically, at least given the time period Gojo stays on screen, but for some reason they just don't do it. And this lack of interest in his story is why it's my least favorite analysis of the season. On top of some other smaller flaws, like a near non-existence of proper jokes, and an actually non-existent cutaway gag that exclusively boils down to the characters postulating. And while I do like seeing Wiz getting passionate about science and math, him maniacally laughing at the possibility of it, I don't know, I just feel like that borders on Flanderization. Though to be fair, I do like Boomstick's curses line, and his method of simplifying Gojo's red and blue powers was charming. And the editing in this analysis is phenomenal. I really like the use of color theory across both breakdowns, if I'm being honest. And since you're seeing Makima's analysis on screen, I might as well say that Makima's was the stark opposite, where it was actually kind of amazing. And I'm sure you paused to see that wall of text I posted earlier, didn't you? You have Wiz beginning with Sans' speech. I don't know why this is here, but it's funny, so whatever. And the world building for Chainsaw Man is so much better here with how they explain what devils are and talk about the devil hunters, specifically the gun devil, who they say struck fear into all of Japan. And then when they reveal that Makima is a devil herself, they cover her powers and explain how she's a bigger threat than the gun devil, and later prove it when they cover her feats, being one of 2 devils to be used for her scaling. And they also flesh out her personality and her goals and what her ideal future would look like, though I wouldn't say they exactly try to humanize her, because they say that she is very clearly evil, and they call out her manipulation of Denji, and of course they would call her a dog level and refer to as something that ends with file. Yes, I know what a cinephile actually is, and I know that it's not very sus, but I mean, come on, you and I both know that she's not like us. And another detail I really like is— Yo, is that No More Heroes footage? And another detail I really like is that whenever they refer to Makima using Denji, they exclusively refer to him as the Chainsaw Devil, and only refer to him as Denji when they focus on his mindset outside of Makima's control, subtly referencing how she never really saw Denji as an actual person. And I also like the cutaway gag where Wiz confirms that God is real. Heism is a lie. Excuse me. But one more thing to note, before the fight, they lay out some ground rules and manipulate the setting to make the matchup more streamlined and their verdict to be easier to decipher. They're saying that curses and devils are comparable? Sure, that makes sense. Saying that Gojo and Makima are citizens of the same Japan? Interesting decision given the verdict they go with, but hey, I'm sure you could say that there are some episodes that could have benefited from something like this, specifically Madara versus Aizen. But on the other hand, it also means that a matchup like this has an actually functional fight dynamic now. Not my favorite matchup in the world, but given how it was already popular to begin with, I am curious to see if anyone is still advocating for it. And then the fight begins, and the movie theater setup not only has plenty of references to dead combatants, but it's also used to establish how Makima was able to deal the first attack with how she weaponizes those same corpses that turn into Jill's zombies from Marvel vs. Capcom 2 for some reason, and later uses devils that she has control of. It's kind of like with Dio vs. Alucard, where the zombies were clearly used because of time and budget, so I can understand, but this episode gets an extra point because they at least have them in silhouettes. But as for the film she was watching, it should be worth noting that Makima was watching my video on the soundtrack of Kid Icarus Uprising. Say what you will about her, but she's got good taste. Better than yours, given that you haven't watched it for some reason. But like with Cole vs. Alex, this is an inherently flawless animation. Moro's visuals are top-notch as always, but he goes all out with the transitions. Yes, this is a Viz Post thing, and hey, God bless Ringmaster for how good he is at this, but Moro's still the one who makes the hand-drawn shots. Some of them directly reference the art style of Chainsaw Man, and sometimes Jujutsu Kaisen as well, while others are simply in Moro's art style. But either way, he cooked up the best genre of eye candy, and it's something that I'm sure even people who dislike the episode for reasons I may or may not be going into soon can admit. Like, it even captures their characterization really well, like Gojo's smug grins, implying that the goat Gianni Matragrana wasn't already giving a top-notch performance. I will say that he never really capitalizes on his menacing side very much, but a lot of his lines are generally in character, although Makima has been criticized for her characterization, saying that her maniacal laughter is completely out of character. Well, that criticism's already been debunked. Okay, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I can't help but feel like this criticism is mainly coming from people who either A, haven't kept up with the Chainsaw Man manga, or B, just don't understand her character very well. The idea was that Makima was getting annoyed with Gojo's insane durability and inability to take a hit, but over time, she did what she could to make herself feel superior to him. And once she starts banging Gojo, have fun with that line comment, he actually feels the damage. Look at his startled expression and how his eyes are twitching as they're panning downwards. Hell, at one point he even does a little chuckle in an attempt to maintain his confidence, but Makima keeps wearing it down bit by bit, and her laughter is most likely coming from how she's viewing herself as superior to Gojo and finally having him right where she wants him after all that trouble, which is not so dissimilar to the context of when you see her laughing in the Chainsaw Man manga. No, the actual problem is more of a directorial thing. While the laughing makes sense, I feel like the witch cackling is a trifle much. Specifically with its progression. Her laughter starts soft, but subtly grows bigger and bigger, which is fine. But then she goes back to her normal tone, and then starts laughing harder than she's ever laughed before! And I just can't help but feel like it was a weird directorial choice. I've also seen people criticizing her screaming in fear as she gets hit with the infinite void, and while I do think the criticism is more understandable, I still think it's perfectly fine and in character for her. Not just with the infinite information all around her, which would overwhelm anybody, especially with Kagurabachi being relevant unironically, but she's also realizing that, actually, Gojo always considered himself superior even in this moment. Also, the attack itself sort of mirrors the point where she got hit with his red powers, so to have her saying nothing to what's supposed to be Gojo's ultimate attack, despite dying in the process, would be pretty underwhelming, especially since the unlimited void itself looks almost one-to-one with how it looks in the anime, which is more impressive than you might think. I believe that this took everyone's breath away, including Gianni's, which is why Liam had to do the breathing for him. No, seriously, that was Liam breathing right there. And overall, the thing I really like about the fight dynamic is that it kind of does that thing from Mewtwo vs. Shadow. Okay, I know that's not a good start, but hear me out. As I mentioned previously, the real problem with the action is that neither character really does a whole lot. Like, they both individually get 2 hits outside of the death, and these 4 hits where you have no idea who's winning the struggle. With Gojo vs. Makima, it's actually kind of similar and debatably worse. But that's sort of the point with this matchup in particular. Gojo straight up does not take that many hits. And while Makima assuredly does, she's able to just redirect it to some other citizen of Japan and then come back like nothing happened.
Imagine like taking a shit and Makima gets hit and whoops, guess you're wiping at the pearly gates.
She even maintains her demeanor for damn near the entire fight, and at no point does it change. And same with Gojo, which means that the fight dynamic is sort of like a game of Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, where it's Touch of Death. And it works for me here because of how their powers are utilized. Makima kind of figures out pretty quickly that she's physically inferior to Gojo, so she utilizes all the devils she has contracts to do the fighting for her while looking for the opening she needs, and Gojo just has to fight through it all while looking for the opening he needs. It makes the fight shorter than it might need to be, but it still feels engaging to me. And the conclusion is Dio versus Alucard level peak. They offhandedly mentioned that this was a complicated fight, but they proved that dozens of times over, covering the stat gap appropriately, considering every feasible tertiary factor, explaining how Makima's control wouldn't be that effective, describing how Gojo's basic abilities worked as counters to Makima's powers, mentioning how Unlimited Void isn't considered an attack despite being able to take her down, stating how Gojo basically murdered all of Japan. It's some really good stuff here. And Who Wears the Crown is an okay track. Not one of my all-time favorites, but it fits the fight well. I just think that it kind of peaks in the first half. Oh, and also, Therwolf legitimately put a fart sound effect in the track, but I am not gonna tell you where that is. You have to figure that out yourself. Oh, and one last thing. While this was never gonna be in the episode, I'd like to give a shout out to the storyboards having an extra epilogue scene with Gojo walking past Denji and Nayuta, the latter of whom calls Gojo a doggy. Makes me wonder what the next episode could be about. Overall, I'm honestly very surprised with how much I ended up liking Gojo vs. Makima. I can understand why people tend to sleep on this episode, but I guess I'm just a little more woke in that regard. 90 out of 100. The only reason it's not a Supreme episode is because I just thought that Gojo's analysis was boring garbage. But Makima's analysis was great, the choreography was unique, the kill is really good, the voice acting is on par for both, and it just looks really nice. Like, I don't have much more to say than that. Oh, and a side note, go support Zenith and Amanga's take on this fight when it comes out. It looks really good so far. In fact, I'll just link the project trailer in the description below. And I don't want to see a single person making any negatively connotated comparisons to the death battle, whether you're hyping it up or shitting all over it. Can't we just appreciate the fact that we're gonna have two high-budgeted takes on this iconic anime matchup? Please say yes, because I can't imagine a reason why the answer would ever be no. But if for some reason you insist on the answer being no, yeah, I guess I'll feed you to the dogs. Why not? Okay, show of hands. Who expected this? Like, who could have possibly seen this coming? Put your hand down. I know it wasn't you. In fact, the movie theater showing Jack vs. Afro was supposed to confirm Louise doing another Jack vs. Afro, in the sense of it being a fully hand-drawn fight, albeit with more people helping him this time, but still. I was really excited to see this, and even got around to checking out Courage the Cowardly Dog for the first time ever during the waiting period, and on the one hand, yeah, I can understand why my mom forbade me from watching this cartoon growing up. It doesn't get dark too often, but when it does, how did kids not get traumatized from this? But on the other hand, it's more often than not very fun and very sweet, and I'll fully admit that as a grown-ass man, the Hunchback episode made me cry. Oh, and Scooby Doo was my childhood addiction. Oh, and also shout out to Galaxy Video Max moving up in the world and joining the Death Battle team as a video editor, just as DJ got promoted to lead editor. And I gotta say, with the analyses, he did a very solid job. I really like the stylized text, the various motion graphics, and all the other fun edits he does. Though DJ did make at least a handful of edits here and there. If I remember correctly, Max did the majority of the editing here, so yeah. And Scooby's analysis is just the wackiest thing ever, but I mean that in the best way. Like, to add some context, I heard a bunch of people criticizing SpongeBob vs. Aquaman for not really living up to the potential of Toon Force on Death Battle. At first I wanted to dismiss this, but then I noticed that it was generally coming from fans of the episode who admitted that, okay, yeah, this is kind of a problem with the episode. Scooby vs. Courage fixes that by just taking every single one-off gag and funny moment seriously, treating it like a real power that these pooches have. And then they go into some genuinely scary stuff, but there's no tonal clash because they clearly establish how it started off as a gang of teens solving seemingly paranormal crimes, but then they later bring up how the monsters became real, which builds up to the insane cosmic horrors and universal destruction that is in the Scooby Doo franchise. And there's no quirky one-liners about how, "Oh, these pooches are so ridiculously strong, ain't that No. And the transition is kind of brilliant because they go from, they were disguises the whole time, to, it's so silly how obvious the disguises are, to, one day, the mask didn't come off. And we also get some cool facts about Great Danes in real life, info on the Scooby snacks, the rawest tracking edit I've ever seen in my life, and even some visual gags, like this one where instead of going over his feast, it goes over what he's done for a Scooby snack. I'll admit, this is a better way of analyzing Toon Force than both the mask and even Popeye. The former works well because it conveys Toon Force as a dark art, but it was mainly used as a means of explaining how it impacts the world around him. And the latter works because the point was going over how strong his punches were, but that's about it. And it also works better than in SpongeBob's rundown because while it made for good comedy, you could instantly tell where they were gonna go with it. But with Scooby Doo, they play it off as if he had developed these Toon Force powers as a means of responding to the impending doom of real monsters, which makes Wiz and Boomstick taking these powers seriously more genuine, as if they understand his position. And all of this gets payoff with the Scooby-Doo meets Batman reference. Yes, my childhood! Via saying how he recognized the skills, powers, and the various misadventures of Skooks. I feel like the only joke that doesn't work for me is the cutaway gag. Wiz has canonically met Mama Boomstick. How would he not know what she looks like? And then the ending note is definitely one of those abrupt joke endings, but it works well enough when you take it as an explanation of his insane prowess, giving it a bit of a purposefully anticlimactic feel. And I like that. And then we get to Courage's analysis, and thank goodness he's not named Stinky Lulu. Courage's analysis is a lot more story-focused than Scooby, since his series actually got a finale. It starts with a reenactment of Courage's opening, word for word, and like in Jack vs. Afro, Boomstick gets so into it that he ends up invading Wiz's personal space. And then they start going into how he's afraid of several dangerous monsters, demons, and villains. And then they cover his powers like, hey, Courage is actually super powerful. Why is he so afraid of everything? And then Boomstick says how anxiety undermines your self-worth. And then they go into Courage's feats. Oh, I'm sorry. The things he done for love. And going into detail on how abusive Eustace was to Courage, as if he was the cause of Courage's severe anxiety. And then they introduced Scooby Doo into the analysis with a quick line from Boomstick that shrugs off how they just talked about him. And then they ended off with Wiz covering the dark matter meteor, Boomstick giving us an ending monologue about how facing your fears is what makes us stronger, and then ending it off with why his name is Courage. Mwah! Yes! That is 3 pitch perfects. All 3 which being better than most of the movies. Oh, and also Boomstick's dog can destroy the sun, apparently.
I was wondering why he suddenly grew horns and wings.
Yeah, that checks out. But then we get into the fight. Louise wanted to do another Jack vs. Afro, so you know what? Even though this is unscripted, I'll give it as much of a Jack vs. Afro styled analysis to the best of my ability, so let's break it down. We start off with the scenery of the mansion, where the dark hallway and the blue lighting from outside give the dogs this darker texture, really helps sell the feeling of how they're alone. The way that it reflects off of their bodies creates the illusion of 3D space, even though they're fully hand-drawn. And then they bump into each other and they just laugh it off like, oh, what was I worried about? Like, what could possibly scare? This stop-motion monster! Which is a reference to Courage's cartoon using different animation styles. In fact, for the most part, Courage is animated exactly like he is in his cartoon, with a charmingly choppy, hoppy run, and even replicating some exact shots that you would see in various episodes. On top of maintaining the exaggerated expressions, the size-changing head, and the rapid traceback frames that you would see. Is that the right term? I'm not an animator, but is that the right term? And Scooby Doo is animated very much like how you would see characters animated in Hanna-Barbera cartoons. You know, the spinning legs timed with funny sound effects, the also exaggerated expressions, and this one aspect which I would argue is the most defining part of the Hanna-Barbera animation style. Recycled animation! Okay, this isn't actually a super big criticism because, I mean, look at all of this, but it is something that I was able to immediately notice. But then we get to a much brighter room, and the first thing you see is... And then they have a thumb war, just like in that one episode of Courage where he reenacted The Exorcist, but with a mattress. And this leads into the best aspect of this fight. Not only did it start in the most perfect way possible, but the entire reason they're quote-unquote fighting is to make the other dog deal with the monster while they run outside of the mansion. And when this thumb war was in the sneak peek, they actually made a couple of changes for the final episode. Scooby's victory celebration now has a laugh and was also flipped so that it's not breaking the 180 rule anymore. And they also added a scene of that monster. Though this does also have my least favorite scene of the fight, where Courage starts randomly shooting at Scooby. Look, it has good animation, I love the squashing and stretching, and I especially appreciate how Courage is shocked that he disintegrated his friend's head, only to be relieved when Scooby just pulls it out of his trash can head. Also, I just love these facial expressions. But it doesn't explain why Courage was shooting in the first place. And it certainly couldn't have been the monster because the framing was as if he was behind the doggos. But don't worry, this is my only major issue in the entire animation, because I cannot stress enough how well it encapsulates the feeling of their cartoons. Hell, Edward Bosco's Courage is so close to Marty Grabstein's that you'd think they secretly got him to reprise his role. In fact, they almost did.
The idea being Courage versus some other weird messed up creature.
But Marty had no idea what Death Battle was, and while he didn't say no, he wanted to see what they would be able to offer him, and then Death Battle never responded and recasted Courage without saying anything.
Screw them, because they didn't have the courtesy to get back to me and get a hard no. They just kind of chicken shit it out and went the other way and just went ahead and did it, and they figured, who cares?
Fair enough. I will fully admit that I prefer Edward Bosco's Magneto, but that is only out of sheer bias. They're both on the same level of quality and accuracy, and if anyone wants to say his Courage is better, I won't blame them. I mean, I guess I could also point out how Billy's Scooby voice is inconsistent at first. I just felt like he was dipping a little too outside of Scooby, and his first scream is weak. But by the time he makes his second scream, it's pretty much perfect. And the references to these shows, for the most part, are also things that they brought up in the analyses, creating some great cohesion. And then they combined the iconic Scooby-Doo hallway gag with a less iconic Courage reference, where he opens the door to an uncanny sight. Yo, base clay fight reference, when they're gonna bring this game back, cowards? And then they show Godzilla, which is probably a monster Courage would fight, let's be real. But then they get to the scariest sight of them all. Okay, I'll admit that was just a funny edit. Here's what they actually showed.
A good villain should be evil, not Zan, conniving, not Zan, well thought out, not Zan.
Oh, the poor dog! And then he opens another door to see Scooby duplicating himself in a disguise, which keen-eyed viewers would be able to see foreshadowed in the hallway gag. And I also like how these are the only times you see Scooby in this gag, implying that he's had more experience with these hallway shenanigans than Courage has. I'm absolutely stretching, but like, this is Toon Force. I can stretch however long I want to. I also really like how the Zabrinsky triangle was utilized, where Scooby duplicated himself to pull it off, using Courage as the unfortunate victim. And then it breaks Wiz and Boomstick's fourth wall yet again. And then it leads to outside of the mansion, and oh no! Scooby looks really, really weird here. Bad fight, bad fight. You should be ashamed of yourself, Death Battle. Clearly somebody didn't pay attention to my Jack vs. Afro analysis. This frame where his head looks disproportionate to his body, and where his hind legs look like they're his front legs, that's just to sell the velocity of Scooby busting out of the mansion. Then we get this nightmarish looking Scooby Doo, and Courage gets to do some fourth wall breaking.
This could be bad. My name isn't Chad James. And it's not.
Actually, the phrase is, or my name is Chad James, and it's not. I hope somebody got fired for that blunder.
And then Scooby Snacks made the Great Dane burst out of the pile as he grows and grows and grows, and Asura's Wrath, where you at? And is that a fucking One Punch Man reference too? Oh, and side note, I don't think I've ever seen a greater power move than eating one of, if not your opponent's biggest trump card. Another thing I like about this scenery, not only do you outright see the Mystery Machine, but if you look close enough, you can see Courage's family home, recontextualizing what they were doing in the mansion and why they were screaming their owners' names. Also, I like how you only see the farmhouse when Courage is screaming at Scooby-Doo's punch. It's like he's facing his fears and remembering his family name, like they're powering him up in a way. And then as Scooby crashes to the ground, they weakly slap one another with the stiffest animations in the episode, but like, look at how tired out they are. Can you blame them? And then it's revealed that the monster was Eustace the whole time, meaning that the dedicated attention to him and Courage's analysis finally got its payoff. And Courage's home being nearby makes even more sense. And then the Chest of Demons pulls in Eustace like he's made of musical notes. Okay, there, I said music. Forever Terror Night is just It's Terror Time again, but scored to match the animation and also including bits of Courage's soundtrack, namely the Crisis theme with the bongos and the credits theme with the ending ukulele. And for the record, the Death Battle team is fully aware of what they were doing here. They know that it's a legally distinct version of It's Terror Time again, and they're fully embracing that, so props. And apparently the forever part of the name is supposed to be in reference to how the fight would go on forever. Overall, I'd say Scooby vs. Courage definitely lived up to the promise. A solid 7 out of 10. The conclusion is really good. God bless them actually going out of their way to explain why they think it would be a tie, instead of just going with the cop-out ending like with Chuck vs. Segata and The Mistake, or just having the characters consciously decide not to fight each other. It really is a breath of fresh air. And I know that basically everyone and their Scottish grandmother has pointed this out, but given how the conclusion brought up how Computer failed to bring up any information on Scooby, seeing Courage try his best to work his way around it in the fight is such an awesome detail. And a part of me also likes to think that Computer knew exactly what Courage was trying to do, but he reluctantly decided to help him out anyway. I like that. It equalizes their stats, not just with the crossover film, but with Courage being in crossovers with other Universal characters like Ben 10 and Billy and Mandy. Are they actually Universal? I don't know the cartoon very well, so let me know in the comments. And them equalizing their stats means that Scooby destroying the dark matter meteor would be kind of a non-factor, because it would just be them fighting over a chance to use it, only for them to never really get much of a chance to use it, apparently. And they even reference the poll from its Death Battle cast episode, having them be at dead even. And then it ends with Boomstick being happy about Eustace dying, calling back to moments where he's expressed his distaste for dog abusers and murderers. And with how brilliantly written and whimsical this episode was, it should be no surprise that this season 10 episode to possibly challenge Sauron vs. Lich King for 3rd place gets a 98 out of 100. Okay, hear me out. Oh, jeez, Rick. He already spoiled his opinion about this episode. Yeah. This is getting that 99 out of 100, and also my 2nd favorite episode of this season, and also challenges Sauron vs. Lich King for my 3rd favorite episode of the show. Possibly, but let me explain myself. So Rick and Morty is a show that I did check out, and I liked the first 2 seasons, but I did kind of fall off around season 3 as I just could not be bothered to finish it. But Doctor Who? It's actually a really special show to me, but maybe not in the way that you think. I've only seen the first 4 series of the modern Doctor Who show, but back in my day, Why am I saying that? I'm 25 years old. I don't know what high schoolers in marching band have to say about this, but speaking as someone who was in marching band during high school, let's just say that you develop a lot of passionate interests. I mean, for some, it could be Harry Potter, Phantom of the Opera, Tales of Symphonia, etc., etc. I'm sure you get it. But there is that one interest that your music section is consistently obsessed with, and in my situation, it was Doctor Who. Constantly talking about it, visiting each other's houses just to watch episodes, helping other people get into the show, and screaming at people for liking filler episodes. Yeah, I'm sure you might know what I'm talking about. And now that I'm in grad school, apparently the dean of the department I'm studying under is a massive Doctor Who fanboy, so I cannot escape this franchise even when I'm not watching it. And while I wouldn't say this is my preferred for the Doctor, I am more of a Constantine enjoyer, I did get around to understanding the appeal of this matchup. Like, in some ways, their writing styles are a lot more similar than you would think them to be. And revisiting Doctor Who during the waiting period reminded me of why I felt an outspoken appreciation for the show in the first place. So this ended up being the episode I was looking forward to the most out of any other season. Even more so than Guts vs. Dimitri, to an extent. But then there's the revisit. I do want to go back to something I said in my season 9 video, where I said that Liam might not be as good of a writer as we've been hyping it up to be, which I still stand by, and as far as I'm aware, I handled my case very well. But this, I'm about to go into the stark opposite of why his writing style can work wonders for a death battle episode. And yes, I know that Ben Singer was a co-writer for this episode, but generally speaking, the positives I'm about to dissect can and will apply to other episodes that he writes, even a couple of his weaker episodes in some extents. Rick's analysis makes brilliant use of Wiz and Boomstick with how they talk about him. Wiz doesn't gush over Rick's big brain and amount of gadgets, but to compensate, he's the one who enlightens the viewer on Rick's nihilism and mindset, as well as what he does to his family. And Boomstick's edginess gets to shine in ways where he's the one to gloss over them. And then you have Wiz explaining how Rick's coat can cause instant death, and Boomstick brushes it off because he's the Rickest Rick. Normally, both take turns nuancing the characters, which I do generally prefer, but this ties into the duality of Wiz and Boomstick that I really, really like, and done so in a way that I like just as much as the former route. It also helps nuance Rick as why he's the way he is, why he thinks he's the smartest man in the universe, why he's a nihilist, why he's the Rickest Rick. It helps nuance both sides of him and what makes him a fascinating character to some, as well as symbolize the duality and how the fan base has historically viewed Rick as a character. Though Wiz still gets to be the scientist type with how he's the one to cover Rick's more complex inventions, and even become that kind of scientist with moments like how he mentions pickles or fruits. And the cutaway gag, it was predictable, but I like how it sort of matches the background footage where it's used as a means of subtly explaining how Rick's portal gun would be able to kill someone. I think that the only problem with the episode is that Rick's wife is never name dropped a single time. I mean, I kind of get why, since Rick refuses to go into it himself, but it still could have been used to elaborate on his mindset and why he likes to shove his family aside, and there was an opportunity to name drop her with his backstory. But then again, I did say only problem with the episode. So let's go into the Doctor's analysis. Before the Doctor is name dropped, they show an Among Us poster with Alf and Shrek. Okay, Max, I see you. The analysis itself is almost 8 minutes long, easily being one of, if not the longest analysis they ever did. They don't just cover the Doctor as a character, but also the history of the Time Lords and what they can do. They also cover his adventures very interestingly, starting off with some of the weirder and sillier adventures, but gradually transitioning into bigger and deadlier accomplishments, like defeating Satan and the Daleks. They also mention that while he doesn't want to get into fisticuffs, you'll never expect him to give people fates worse than death. And the different tones with the background music help make the tonal change feel more natural. And the way that they parallel Rick is ingenious, bringing up his war-torn side and how it had always been there, being used as a means to play off of Rick's nihilism. And all of these gadgets have literal Deus Ex Machina properties, which is used to play off of Rick being the smartest man in the universe who can win at everything. And the way that they end off their analyses also has an interesting contrast to it. With Rick, the analysis builds him up as a hardcore cynic where you can lick his balls. But in the ending, they still add how he has a soft spot for his family. But with the Doctor, they portray him as a quirky British man. They go into some of their more complex and even darker struggles, and also call him the most dangerous thing in the universe. And this ties into the running theme of the analysis. You'd be glad to have them on your side, but if you're against them, run. And then there's the editing, which really gets to show off Max's editing style, since this was his first solo work. More motion graphics, more stylized text. Also, I like them mentioning popular fan castings for when they bring up the 16th Doctor. He's absolutely won me over, and you should definitely go check out his original Versus shows if you haven't already. But then we get into the fight.
Shut the fuck up, Morty! I knew Time Lords were suicidal morons!
That is... Oof. They did the censoring for me. Also, it is kind of weird how the intro is just another, hey, you cut me off, asshat. But apparently this was an intentional creative choice. But I will say that the designs of the characters look like they're straight out of Rick and Morty, even utilizing the quirks of its animation style. The Doctor being in this art style did throw me off at first, as he looks rather lanky, but I got used to it pretty quickly. I mean, do you remember the things that Donna Noble once said about him? Don't blame me if you forgot, because so did she. Though I do want to give a shout out to the little Easter eggs on Rick's ship. The 3 stickers on his space cruiser are replaced with your versus matchup, which is basically just one way of saying your versus matchup. It sucks and I hate it, so stop showing it to me. And there's another sticker that says Bill was here, good job nerd. And then there's the rock sticker from Wiz's shirt. But by the end of the fight, they get replaced with I voted in the Tournament of Champions, Discord is pretty swell, and a Death Battle 12-month membership badge. This goes into a very unique aspect that I'll be going into later. One of the things that make this episode for me is that Death Battle wrote Rick better than Justin Rayland ever could. Like, the whole fight has a dynamic of cynical nihilist versus peppy optimist. You know, with the intro where the Doctor avoids conflict and Rick acts as the aggressor, and how most of the exchanges between them demonstrate how one character is just having a good time and the other is having absolutely none of it. And you might also notice that the Doctor never once goes for a direct attack. He's always defending himself or disarming Rick's weapons and gadgets. It's kind of like Cable versus Booster Giovanna, where there's a functional dynamic to the banter that they take full advantage of. Although I think Rick Tor does it better here. That episode kind of relied on Cable getting angry with him, which works for what the episode is trying to be, but here, the Doctor is at least taking Rick seriously. He may be quipping, going on tangents, messing around with him and the like, but he still sees Rick as a formidable foe that stands in the way. Also, while Rick responds to his quips, his responses are always blunt and impatient, and he's still able to damage the Doctor a lot, even getting to show off his intelligence around the end. Hell, he was even skeptical of the Doctor's advice during the Weeping Angel scene, testing it out before getting disgruntled. And there are even some smaller details, like how Rick is exclusively focused on fighting the Doctor, who's taking in the sights and appreciating the world around him, including the screaming sun, showing that he does in fact value life, and yes, that was the intent of this scene. And in the TARDIS, Rick isn't just destroying the interior, he's violating it as well. And the Doctor is reasonably heavily concerned for her, as even just a grappling hook getting stuck on it is enough to put him in a panic. Now that he sees Rick and his clones eradicating it, he's too shocked to do as much as move a muscle, and tries to move around in an attempt to fix it. Look at this running animation! They even got this right! Like, look at how tight his posture is! That's how you know they did their homework! Though it does have this moment where Rick is weirdly layered in his running animation, but it's only something you notice when you pause the video and look at it for too long. And then the TARDIS switches rooms around, and you see the Doctor hesitating to bring out the DMAT gun because the Time Lords forbade its use under normal circumstances. And then Rick comes through with a portal on his back? Where did that come from? Well, you may have missed how one of the Ricks took the portal gun out of the Doctor's hand. So I guess the weird thing is that it never fired, but it at least makes sense how Rick was able to do it in the first place. And then Rick has the Doctor cornered, and he explicitly shoots both of the Doctor's hearts, which works as a subtle payoff to Rick somehow knowing about the Time Lords. Though I will say that his "I got a grandson waiting on me" line is kind of flaccid and overwritten, though I guess you gotta fill in that time somehow because the regeneration does take a sweet-ass time. Just enough time for the Doctor to give an epic speech before weaponizing it, which in turn leads to another inverse reference not so dissimilar to how they utilized I've Been Playing Human all the way back in 2015. In the regeneration scene, you know that one meme where the Final Fantasy character dies all because he made a minor spelling mistake? This radiates the exact same energy. And then the portal is being used to have the Doctor indirectly kill Rick, but it's still open just enough to make room for a shot. This was a brilliant use of Chekhov's gun that still managed to have Rick fighting on his last legs before getting shot with the DMAT gun. And then you have the ending. Even if the Doctor takes taking in Morty as a companion would have been cathartic, it still feels very Doctor Who coded, where it feels like he knows what just happened, but still talks with the other person at their level. Very similar to how Doctor Who episodes normally end. And I also like the blink and you'll miss it fourth wall awareness, where he looks to the audience as he says, "Don't be a cynic." It's just a very nice note to end off on, especially with Rick coming back as a hologram saying he'll haunt Morty, but Morty forgets Rick anyway. And that's what really makes this episode interesting. It starts off like a Rick and Morty episode before slowly and steadily transitioning into a Doctor Who episode. You can even see this tone in the track, Wubba Lubba Alonzi. At first glance, you think that this is heavily based around the Doctor Who theme song, which it definitely is, but I also noticed some similar textures to the Rick and Morty theme song. And sci-fi orchestra is a prominent genre for both series, so you can definitely fit it in both somewhere. At least until the ending, which definitely takes more influence from the orchestra you hear in the Doctor Who soundtrack. Though there is one more thing that I felt Liam did a very, very good job with. Remember Aang's episode? Okay, I get why you might have blanked it out of your mind, but like with the Silver Surfer, this is the stark opposite of how pacifists like Aang have been handled. Or, I really shouldn't be using the word pacifist. I guess that's just a word that the Death Battle community likes to use for the sake of simplifying things, and even I fall into that trap. Contrary to popular belief, the Doctor isn't necessarily a pacifist. Sure, he uses violence as a last resort, that's only because he knows when to use it and when not to use it. He has so much knowledge about the multiverse that he knows when to incapacitate something, persuade the monster to not kill them, or when to get rid of them. And I feel like the episode handled that aspect of the character phenomenally well. Like I said, he never once uses a direct attack on Rick. And while the DMAT gun is eventually used, it's not by the Doctor. That scene where he hesitates to use it, that's him wondering if it was really worth it. And the killing blow was more so done out of Rick's aggressive behavior rather than the Doctor actually killing him. The fight also has some extremely subtle character moments that may go over a typical viewer's head, like Rick looking back and waiting for the ship to take Morty out of the vortex, ensuring that he really does care about Morty. And then there's the conclusion where they equalize their stats, which is kind of weird given the speed feats used, but at the same time, how are you able to explain Doctor Who stats to a casual audience? I don't even think that Doctor Who power scalers know how to do that, so Death Battle should be lucky that there is a way to come up with an argument for the Doctor winning with equalized stats. Though their ships have stats, with the space cruiser being put at solar system level and the TARDIS being placed at universal, which I'm pretty sure is a lowball for both, but what can you do? And they say that while Rick has deadlier weapons, their equalized speeds meant that Rick would have a tough time getting the jump on him. Plus the Doctor's technology and his Time Lord physique could disable Rick's weapons and resist his time warping shenanigans respectively. And they also say how the DMAT gun could bypass Project Phoenix, and there's also this black box where the Doctor could resist Rick's Omega device. The Doctor's mastery of space and time is greater than or equal to Rick's, but he's had more fighting experience and is a faster thinker. Rick has also been outsmarted, whereas the Doctor has not. The comparisons tab, as much as they simplify things, I feel like they do a really good job of it. And that, braggers, is why Liam is a better writer in some episodes when compared to others. And I guess you could ultimately say I'm on hashtag let Liam cook within limits. And with that, now it's time to answer a question I introduced at the beginning of this section that you may or may not have forgotten about. Even if it got the legendary 99, do I like this episode more than Sauron vs. Lich King? Unfortunately, no. But that is because Sauron vs. Lich King has pros that this episode straight up could not live up to, like the unmatched cinematography, or how it fully immerses itself in its high fantasy setting. And I also don't think I could rank it higher than Balrog vs. TJ combo, mainly because it straight up has the best underdog story that Death Battle has ever written. But hey, this is still in my top 5 favorite episodes, so yeah.
Oh, there's one more thing.
I do occasionally get people acting really anal about the scores I give certain episodes, but if you really look at the supreme tier I have so far, damn near every episode's placement, while fully ranked, is heavily based on things that I think are less good than the other. Not even bad in comparison or even worse than the other. Just straight up, both are good, but one is just slightly more good than the other in my opinion. That's also why I like to rank episodes out of 100 instead of out of 10, because ranking things out of 10 is stupid. Slash G! Okay, I guess I've already explained my second favorite episode of the season, so wonder what could possibly be left. Oh, wait. People are actually happy to see this episode? Even the people who doubted it ended up changing their minds on it and called it a masterpiece? Well, I didn't expect that, but alrighty then. Roll it. thunk that Goku vs. Superman 3 would make everybody happy, even if you do see the occasional person insisting that they only made this for money. They just love milking Goku vs. Superman. That shouldn't mean anything. Death Battle haters learn to make a single good criticism challenge. Impossible! To those who are gonna ignore me disrespecting their bad faith criticism and comment that baseless rhetoric anyway, y'all gotta keep in mind that Goku vs. Superman 2 is Ben Singer's least favorite episode of the series. I did a pretty good job on touching upon that, but it has been quite a while, so for a brief recap, his problems had less to do with the episode's overall quality in the animation, and more to do with how it was marketed. Ben wanted it to be more of a continuation, as well as to include the remaining research that they did for the first episode. But the problem was that his boss was a grifter even before he started playing favorites with the right side of the eagle, so the marketing pushed it as a rematch instead. That, and Ben intended this to be his final word on the matchup, which meant Goku vs. Superman 3 would never happen.
Cowards!
Cowards? I don't think that guy can handle a third one. You want Goku to lose again? Do you really want that?
Yes!
I mean, it still technically didn't. Though the supposedly irrelevant sequel actually did convince most people that Superman is stronger than Goku, but then along came Donkey Kong, who took his finger and went... Despite initially being accused of being biased towards Superman, as it turned out, they were biased against Superman. Season 8 was around the time where more people started to call out the irrelevant sequel's disrespect towards Superman. He may have won, but saying that Superman is boring is dead ass one of the first things they say about him in the episode, barring any obligatory name drops. Moments like this didn't just lead to people thinking Goku can never beat Superman, but this also led to a lot more people misunderstanding Superman, and to an extent DC superheroes in general, especially since the episode aired just before people had a weird fetish for making Superman evil, be it through a character or their own garbage take on Superman. I recommend checking out Shady Durags' video if you really want to see what a well-written Superman truly looks like. And hey, he directly blames Death Battle for the common folks' misunderstanding of Superman, pointing out how they tried so hard to sugarcoat Goku losing a second time that they ended up constructing a whole-ass narrative that Superman was boring, along with how they misunderstood why Goku would be boring with Superman's power. Finally, a good Death Battle criticism that I didn't come up with on my own. This idea was on Ben Singer's mind since the start of the decade. While the irrelevant sequel eventually tried to go for an understanding of the characters, it was not proof-written at all. No joke, he shoved it in 2 days before the episode premiered out of panic, which, funnily enough, added to the disrespect of Superman because there was clearly more effort put into saying how great of a character Goku is, and then go, that's right, Boomstick, Superman is like this, the end. And to add on to that, Death Battle in general was starting to make people believe that DC characters are just these unstoppable and broken superheroes who can never lose in a fight against people who aren't from Marvel. I mean, it's hard to exclusively blame Death Battle given how DC was being treated in non-comic book media, but given how prominent its footing was planted in internet culture, it emitted a gas that lit so brightly that it kickstarted a near-decade-spanning arms race of people outright hating DC characters and acting like they have no personality. Back then, this was widespread across the internet as comic books started becoming less topical, even spreading to the Death Battle team for a time. Though thankfully, Ben and other Death Battle team members learned to appreciate Superman more and more while never once losing their respect for Goku. And yes, the self-proclaimed free thinker will still call this a cash grab, even after hearing me explain all of this. But the real ones will notice that, above all else, this episode was Ben Singer's passion project. He didn't just want to give this matchup one more shot, he wanted to do the characters justice, explicitly as its own thing, disconnected from the original classic and its sequel. And in this situation, I'm giving it its own fully scripted rundown. Not so much because I want to give it one, but it basically deserves it, let's be real. And that's because of one reason. What if I told you that they once again worked in the whole man who can break any limits versus man with no limits to break in the first place idea from the other Goku vs. Superman videos, but were much more subtle about it and done in a way that actually respected the characters instead of trashing on one of them unintentionally? In fact, let's talk about this rhetoric real quick, because I feel like I've been ignoring the implications of it for far too long. Despite being done twice before, Ben always believed the summary to be a simplification of both characters despite being accurate to the debate. In the original classic, they linked this sentiment as the core of their characters, but by doing that, they failed to notice that the Riddler left a few gaping holes in the script. Like, what limits does Goku need to face, and why does Clark not need to deal with those limits himself? What do you mean Superman has no limits despite putting a finite number on his power? However, I still stand that this does work as a thematic note to end off the conclusion, because as outdated as it may be, the research was still extensive enough to justify having one, which means that this idea represents what those numbers mean. Also, this was the first time they tried tying one of these bows on a package, so naturally, it'd be really clumsy, and I can't imagine a reason why you still be so passionately distasteful towards it today. Though, I definitely agree that this rhetoric is not strong enough to be used as the crux of a debate, which is exactly why I criticized Death Battle for trying to pull this a second time with even less substance. They brought up all of these new feats for Superman, but completely ignored any and all new feats for Goku, despite him receiving new feats and forms that helped him take down stronger opponents, and despite being heavily involved in the marketing of the episode, even going as far as to putting those forms on all versions of the thumbnail. And as I mentioned before, the whole conclusion and ending Q&A feels like an insecure versus debater feeling the need to repeat his points in bad faith, rather than someone naturally expanding on his opinion. And given how a bunch of this episode consisted of research that was cut from its predecessor, I consider all of this to be yet another major failing of this episode. I still think it can work as a summary of the characters when handled well, but the question is, how do you handle it well? Simple. Keep it in the analyses. Goku's analysis focuses on his training and feats, but it's done in a different way than normal. They actually start off with the creation of Dragon Ball and how Goku left an impact on anime and manga, even pointing out Goku's uncommon strength. And then they cover his training under Roshi, where we see this little gem of an Easter egg. Oh, and by the way, the Death Battle team actually thinks this and will die on that very hill. No joke, they have unironically tried arguing this in external articles. But I love that. And it's almost like these guys are big fans of Dragon Ball or something. Oh yeah, and there's also this cute callback to the original classic.
Within just a few years, he was so strong, the only worthy teachers left were gods. And a talking cat, but mostly gods. At 15, he was already so powerful that the only worthy teachers left were gods. And a talking cat, but mostly gods!
And then they go into Saiyan physiology with the whole what doesn't kill you makes you stronger sort of thing, explaining how quickly Goku mastered Roshi's various techniques like the Kamehameha, and starts by covering small-scale feats like dodging lightning. I really just called lightning dodging small scale. They also cover the differences from the old English dub like the first two episodes, which you might think is just there for baseless trivia, but the last time they mentioned it was a mistranslation, they forgot to clarify what the actual phrase was supposed to be. And that's where this quote comes in, where they finally elaborate on the original quote pertaining to Goku accepting his Saiyan heritage. I guess it would have been more interesting if they saved this for the end of the rundown after building up to how Saiyans are inherently violent, but this is supposed to be an analysis that blends in story analysis with trivia, or at least it makes sense to do so given how the older episodes had separate focus on character and background information, especially with the second one almost exclusively focusing on trivia. So with that context, I think it's appropriate. And as for the build-up on the training, it's not necessarily about numbers this time around, but rather the build-up is about the transformations and who he's defeated. They start by mentioning how Goku's golden forms allowed him to defeat Frieza. Then they bring up the power multipliers, and then the part where he became a god. Also, threw us for a loop? I'm sure they did. And said god form is explained by the fact that the Dragon Ball universe got bigger! Is this gonna be the new Thor speed meme? And then they say how he matched Beerus in power. And then they bring up Hit, Infinite Zamasu, Jiren, bringing up their immeasurable power and use the Ultra Instinct form as a means of explaining how he surpassed said power. Going over things like how much faster he's gotten to a point where Ultra Instinct pushes his limits and automatically blocks and or dodges all attacks thrown at him. And then they elaborate on CC Goku and why he should be comparable to the normal Goku, mentioning even more insane feats of defeating powerful foes. Okay, that was a lot to unpack, and some of it was just, oh hey, this is what they wrote. But that's kind of what they say at the end. Goku doesn't just inspire other anime, he inspires people to go further beyond and break any limits. Oh, and also I really like the editing. Obviously you have some snazzy looking manga edits, specifically this dodging one, like, ooh, this edit is so fucking good, man. But the sound design is exclusively comprised of Dragon Ball sound effects, which even as a Dragon Ball hater, makes me feel very nostalgic. And then there's Superman's analysis. You're probably probably not asking, wait, if Superman being limitless is the point of this analysis, how is that not disrespectful? Well, let's get into that. It is similar to Goku in how they start off with small-scale feats, and then they add that iconic classic quote of his speed and power.
Geez, just a locomotive? People in the 40s needed bigger imaginations.
That they poke fun at. They generally frame Superman as a simple solution to overwhelming problems. I've heard that this is kind of a simplification of his origin and story, but I've also heard that it's a good way of simplifying it, so it's fine. After all, it's yet another deep dive into a story that mentions his creators' upbringings and what led him to become the first superhero. Briefly explaining his story and even taking shots at Zack Snyder's bad take on Superman. Based. Though this isn't the only misconception they discuss, however, as they also go over the mind-numbingly common criticism of, his lower-scale feat happened to Superman, and there are plenty of others that have happened to Superman, so he's very clearly not multiversal. So you're saying you want Death Battle to make the Ben versus Hal mistake again. Why is this criticism a thing? And that's the question Death Battle asks as well, because they acknowledge the compositing problem by providing evidence that the comic book composite is kinda canon. They mostly cover the vast array of crazy powers he has that don't get used in the fight, but the straightforward ones he's most known for have some elaboration, specifically the heat vision. Instead of just saying that it's hotter than the sun for a third time, Wiz literally says that his powers defy physics, and they go into detail about that. Each feat getting more and more bombastic and ludicrous. But despite this, Ben claims that Clark still has limits, so what are they? This is where they put a lot of emphasis on the mental blocks he built in his mind after finding out about his Kryptonian heritage, both being used to explain why he restrains his power so much and why post-crisis Clark was considered weaker than his pre-crisis self. And what's interesting is that this is technically also used to parallel Goku's training, adding a neat contrast where Goku had to work towards his overwhelming power while Superman had to learn how to control it. And another thing is that they outright bring back the weaknesses tab. You want to know the last time we saw one of these? Donkey Kong vs. Knuckles, all the way back in 2015, where they also mentioned their stupidity.
I really hurt my finger doing that bit.
Yeah, no, I saw.
As for why it didn't show up in Goku's rundown, I theorize it's because it would have been incongruent with how Death Battle was analyzing his story, and having it show up at the beginning may have been a bad look given how Link vs. Cloud 2021 was received when it tried something similar. Meanwhile, they did this for Superman because they wanted to best avoid the rhetoric that Superman has no limits, which I guess is also incongruent with how the team personally scales Clark, but they framed the man without any limits idea in a different way. They say that while Superman's power should have a limit, what doesn't have a limit is how he's willing to use his powers to help others. He's always using his power for things as small as saving a cat from a tree, or things as big as shattering a multiverse with a single punch to stop his multiverse from being replaced. His absolute power does not have to corrupt him absolutely, as he still chooses to use his powers for the good of the people. In other words, Clark needed to bypass those mental blocks to become a simple solution to overwhelming problems. And by Martel, this fucking background music is golden. It's a no copyright piece called Gesture of Celebration A. And hearing it during the World Forger feat and having that get followed up with the ending spiel about who Superman is, just out of this outerverse, my guy. Legitimately the best use of music in any Death Battle analysis since TJ combos. But of course, we gotta see if this debate truly ends once and for all, where the fight begins in media res.
Shut up!
They give a line of context for why they're fighting, which makes this fight feel like it just started.
Today's the day. We'll finally settle who's stronger.
If you say so.
I like seeing Superman humoring Goku to fight even though he doesn't like fighting, so he keeps holding back the entire time. And I guess it's a little weird to see Clark not feeling reluctant outside of his, if you say so, but sometimes you gotta give them a reason to fight. Though I will say, I don't fully love Xander Mobus as Superman. I don't think it's bad, and he does act like Superman more often than not, but with his voice, I just keep hearing his Joker for some reason. It also feels a bit stuffy in some areas.
I'm doing just fine. All right, I'll show you just how powerful I really am.
Just a bit. I still think it's a pretty good performance overall, but Michael Kovac as Goku, however, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I like it more than Sean Schemmel's. I'm dead serious. I truly think that Michael Kovac is a better Goku than, well, Goku himself. Even with his stellar performance as Goku Black, I wasn't fully convinced that he could do it. And I especially wasn't fully convinced during Gogeta vs. Vegito. I still don't understand why you would want to step away from Moscow X's Goku only to have Goku do a less impressive Moscow X. But geez, talk about a redemption arc. My only complaint is that he slightly overdoes the chuckles, but other than that, this is among my favorite performances in the show. The screams, the peppy dialogue, the confidence and wholesome deliveries. Hell, by the end of the fight, he pretty much turned into Goku. I normally show distaste for this phrase, but I think it's fair to say it here. Funimation, hire this man. Assuming he's not too busy being in pretty much every indie cartoon you can find. And it's not just the voice acting that makes this fight for me, but the individual character moments as well. It fixes the main issue I had with the original sequel where they made this fight wholesome. Clark gets to relax and let loose without fear of hurting someone, and Goku's loving the challenge of a unique style and move pool. They fight, but it feels more like a celebration of skill and power. They're laughing like children throughout, trading compliments, being wait a minute. I also like this smile from Clark. I know that it's supposed to be separate from the other two episodes, but there are moments that feel like they are connected, at least spiritually. And in that lens, this smile is a moment of Clark feeling impressed by Goku's speed, and Goku smiles back as a means of saying, hey, now that I've gotten better, let's have some fun. And then Goku starts noticing that Clark's holding back, and Clark responds with,
I'm doing just fine.
Still seeing this as a modest sparring match at most. I also really like the Kryptonian fabric exchange just because it feels like a nice change of pace. Seeing Goku impressed with Clark starting to give it his all, noticing how his suit doesn't get destroyed nearly as easily as Goku's gi, and also this exchange.
Oops. Well, I guess we can wish it back later.
World made of cardboard.
Okay, full disclosure, this is actually my least favorite part of the episode. Look, I get the idea behind it. It's meant to be a unique way of escalating the fight, and now that I think about it, the World of Cardboard reference would have fit perfectly well in the original sequel. But my problem is that it goes from Clark going, I forget how uncontrollable my strength is. I need to remember to be more careful. And then the very next sentence, I'll show you just how powerful I really am. I would have preferred Goku to notice his sympathy and have them travel to a universe that's completely empty, and the rest of the fight plays out like normal. Then again, that'd probably either be too much work or it wouldn't be enough to suspend the viewer's disbelief since they'd have to reuse assets. So if these are the lines we gotta work with, I would have just altered it like this.
World made of cardboard.
Well, I guess we can wish it back later.
All right, I'll show you just how powerful I really am.
Same idea, but Superman's enthusiastic tone comes across as a lot less jarring. I mean, maybe you'd have to alter a delivery or two, but otherwise, this is how I think it should have been structured. Now that I'm mentioning it, Superman's characterization is a criticism I've started seeing pop up, especially among comic book fans. And I don't think it's without reason. This might be a crazy take, but if this matchup didn't have the legacy it did, I don't think many people would like it that much. You have Son Goku, the martial artist who seeks the thrill of a fight to become stronger each day, versus Superman, a character who abhors fighting and is just a normal guy who happens to be astronomically powerful. So seeing him going all out like this and not even being fazed that they destroyed the multiverse is out of pocket, even more so than in the irrelevant sequel. Okay, let me explain. I did hear on the grapevine that Goku blowing up the LexCorp building is pretty out of character for him, and okay, but if you take that one moment and remove the detail of it being the LexCorp building specifically, you've just described about 80 to 90% of the action and choreography in the original sequel. And also, that not meant to be relatable jargon is worse than anything and everything this new episode did, but in terms of how he was represented as a fighter, him taking the fight to the city is forever bad. Okay, but other than that, using the Dragon Balls to restore the planet and immediately escaping to a frozen tundra knowing that Goku would want a rematch, and giving Goku multiple opportunities to stand down are more in line with Clark's character than we give it credit for. Though, for the record, this doesn't change my score of the episode in the slightest, as, if anything, this makes Goku's characterization retroactively worse since he comes across as a stubborn baby who can't take no for an answer, but I digress. Even in the original classic, he was far more hesitant to fight and eventually took the fight to an empty area once he started taking things more seriously. But here, while I think Clark's representation is better than those two episodes, his characterization, I think it leaves much to be desired. However, while I get where this criticism comes from, I can see why the team wanted it to be more, for lack of a better term, destructive. As I said in my Season 2 ranking retrospective, the entire episode felt more like a tribute to the debate rather than the matchup. So people seeing Goku dying via some brain disintegration after seeing Goku doing all of this, it It's pretty underwhelming on paper, and maybe even disrespectful in a way. Or at least, that's how Ben felt. So this, to me, feels more like a moment of them going, hey, we gotta have them acting at least a little bit out of character because, you know, this is Death Battle, and giving us a scenario that Superman and his fans have probably never seen before. And unlike with Saitama, I don't think there's a frame of reference for what this could look like. But this isn't a huge deal to me personally. I just want to explain why you see this criticism popping up in various circles. Oh, and just before anyone asks, Goku's characterization is much better than the other two fights. Yeah, he too has the weird, I'ma destroy a planet with no remorse despite the fact that I'm going against an aspect of my character shtick, but seeing him being more upbeat, encouraging his opponent to fight at their best, and using his L as a learning experience to grow stronger rather than refusing to back down are very in line with his character. That was quite a lot to unpack, once again, but I only went into so much detail because admittedly, the rest of it, while very good and flashy, especially this funny shot right here, doesn't have much to talk about aside from ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, unrendered Superman, where'd you come from? But it's not inherently a bad thing. It's just that I'm comparing this fight to an episode like Trunks vs. Silver, where the admittedly basic action is heavily carried by the sheer amount of adrenaline with the gorgeous effects, top-notch voice acting, and blood-pumping music. Goku's auras look stunning, and even Superman's heat vision looks really, really nice. And the super flare looks good too. Even if the textures could use a little more detail, it doesn't bother me that much. I also noticed that they included a little bit of Torian influence here and there. Impressive. Very based. Although there is one thing that you think I'd skim over. The music. Super... Was that the best title you could come up with? Is great. Logan Adams helped Brandon write the lyrics, and it's meant to be Goku explaining why he likes fighting and alleviating Clark's worries as he helps him cut loose. I wouldn't call it my favorite track of the season, and Hedge of Tomorrow and Princess of Pride still hold the title of my favorite Dragon Ball tracks, but I think it's real epic. Not to mention, it has the best musical moment in the series. In this moment, Clark used up a lot of his power after the super flare. We even see him briefly tired out, so he powers up by traveling to every sun he can find across the universe. And in this moment, Goku sees the stars getting put out. No joke, they're actually getting put out in this shot here. Nice detail. Finally, he's going all out. He's ready for Clark's full potential. And in this moment, there's nothing to lose. And in this moment, we hear 4 little words. And then they do a reenactment of the climax of the original Goku vs. Superman, but with Goku using Kaioken and the Ultra Instinct avatar to power it up, throwing everything he's got. But Clark's power ultimately destroyed him, and the planets, and the universe, and I'm pretty sure all of reality in general. And this blink and you'll miss it shot of Galactus versus Unicron. But then we see them in the afterlife. Not sure why Clark's here with Goku since he didn't die from that, but whatever. Still, Clark thanks Goku for a good fight, Goku accepts his loss while vowing to train harder, and they fist bump at the end as they stare at the different versions of their fight happening across the multiverse. Oh, hi Scooby and Courage. Although it does beg the question, Drake? Where are the Dragon Balls? But screw it, let them have their moments. I won't lie, when I saw this the first time, I teared up a little. Although I have heard some people say that Clark saying that Goku almost had him was disrespectful. Fellas, is it disrespectful to enjoy something? And then there's the conclusion, which goes in-depth in a similar fashion to the first episode. Ultra Instinct's comparable to the Theta State? Really? They cover 5 different categories, throw Goku a bone by giving him the skill category, and also this.
Fighting Zamasu as an omnipresent merged timeline also implies immeasurable speeds. Also implies immeasurable speeds. Immeasurable speeds. Immeasurable speeds. Immeasurable speeds.
They said it, boys! They finally said it! They put Goku at immeasurable, they directly said it out loud in an episode. I don't want to see this screenshot being used to slander Death Battle ever again. There's officially no reason to be bothered by this anymore. And you also gotta appreciate how they specifically say how Ultra Instinct is able to keep up with Clark in terms of speed, and how the animation lines up with that argument by having Goku blocking and dodging all of Clark's attacks in this form, as described in the analysis, and even start dealing significant damage to Clark's cape, as well as put him on the back foot and force him to use the super super flare, which by the way, the original sequel never used despite hyping it up as a big thing. I also like the other callback to the original where Boomstick starts off saying how they don't have to hear about it again, only to immediately backtrack by saying how people are gonna argue the outcome regardless. But there is this one last thing that's worth mentioning. It ends with Wiz going into another spiel about what Goku and Superman represent as characters, but it adds a bit of a twist where sometimes it's not fun to see Superman win because of what these icons symbolize. Then he starts having a bit of a crisis where he questions if he is watering down characters to something unconventional, but Boomstick snaps him out of it and says that they're just doing it for fun and it's just another way of enjoying fiction. And then they get into a petty squabble over Boomstick's pun, and they show the winner card with Superman smiling down on them. And a side note, the DC comic artist who made this panel knows about this and he gave his approval. Absolutely based. This whole bit resonated with many people, myself included, but sadly, it's not all good things with this. Like, they say that comic book superheroes have stagnated over the years, which makes no sense to me, because Death Battle has stated the literal opposite on more than one occasion. So I don't understand why they're saying it here and acting like anime has never stagnated itself. And there's also the whole who wants Goku to lose thing. While I get the idea behind it, it's kind of extreme. I've also heard other people say that it's sappy, maybe even a little pandering, and it didn't need to be here, and there are other smaller problems with this monologue that can build up over time. And yeah, I would dock points for all of that as well. If the episode was written by anyone other than Ben Singer. I often hear the argument that, as a consumer, it's not your job to care about behind-the-scenes context or the struggles that a creator's going through. While that's a perfectly fine point in a vacuum, if said consumer wants to look into those aspects, they can retroactively find a lot more to like about it. Take it from me, I've done so much digging into what happened in all of those older episodes, especially when it came to Goku vs. Superman. So to me, this ending is more of a creator sharing his personal experiences with doubting his own work, but came around to loving it again because he was able to find a way to have fun with it. And that's the main reason why this ending stuck with me as much as it did. I mean, there are other reasons, but at the risk of copping out, I can't bring myself to explain them. I guess it just validates longtime Death Battle boomers like myself. But now there's one question I think needs answering. Is this better than Goku vs. Superman, the original sequel? Is it better than the original classic? On a technical level, 2023 won before the word context was even conceived. The quality of the editing, research, and animation are so much better. But do I like it more? The conundrum here is that Ben wanted this to be separate from the other Goku vs. Superman episodes, and while you can make multiple points of cohesion between them all, it's still trying to be its own thing. The way I like to break them down is that one episode wanted to be an event, while the other wanted to be a passion project. Both are special in their own way, but a passion project is one you can appreciate at any time, while with an event, you kinda needed to be there to get full enjoyment from it. But I was. I don't think it's that unpopular of an opinion at this point, but I do still prefer the original classic. Primarily because of nostalgia, I'll own up to that, but I do believe that it had more going on. Wow, who would have thunk that a 10-minute fight would have more content than a 4-minute fight? But I also think that the first one had more creative action, more ambitious cinematography, and even better voice acting despite the mic peaks. At least for Clark. Kovac is still the definitive Goku to me at this point, but the action in this fight is kind of, samey. A lot of it is just fast-paced rushdowns, ki blasts, and heat vision. Obviously, I wasn't expecting any of Clark's Toon Force sneezing or any of his other wackier powers, but no Frost Breath, no pressure point combat, no phasing, really? I feel like all three of those abilities are iconic enough to where you could have used them in the fight. I also think that the Super Saiyan transformations are kind of worse overall, because of 2013's aforementioned cinematography and how it feels like Goku really needed to power up to match Clark, whereas here Goku just kind of transforms because it looks cool. Like, as much as I adore the effects, why did Goku become blue here? The only transformation I feel comes close would be the Ultra Instinct one, but I will also say, generally speaking, this is the definitive Goku vs. Superman death battle, even if it's not my favorite. For what it wants to do and what it's trying to do, it's a very solid 8 out of 10 episode. But for what it speaks to me, a longtime Death Battle fan who has done copious amounts of research and analysis from multiple angles of Death Battle, specifically during Season 10, this episode means more to me than a lot of others do. Arguably rivaling that of my actual favorites like Dante vs. Bayonetta, Balrog vs. TJ, Jack vs. Afro, and yes, even Guts vs. Dimitri. So as a compromise, it only feels right to give this episode an 89 out of 100. But there are many people who consider this to be one of, if not the all-time best episode in this series. And even if I don't agree with that, I can see why. Not bad, Ben. Not bad in the slightest. And I'm sure that you know all too well that growth is awkward, often embarrassing. But if you're able to push through that, you'll get to the point where you'll look back on everything you've done and get to the most anticipated thing you've ever made, and then you'll eventually say to yourself, it was more than worth the wait.
Oblivion.
Bet you didn't expect to see back-to-back fully scripted rundowns, did ya? Once again, it's less because I really wanted to give it one and more that it kinda deserves it. Gotta end with a big finish after starting fairly small, you know? Newer Death Battle fans might not remember or care, but this matchup was pretty much the next Goku versus Superman, sprinkled with a bit of Cole versus Alex here and there.
So yes, eventually there will be Galactus versus Unicron. We know. Like,
you hear that reaction? People wanted this fight so badly, but then you notice that 8-year time gap and yeah. Outside of hardcore Death Battle boomers, this matchup was kind of forgotten by the modern audience, where people got a little too tired of waiting and found more interest in other matchups, which is probably why this episode has a lower view count despite its legacy. And on top of that, plenty of people in the community gave up hope that this matchup was ever gonna happen, where even the Death Battle team would occasionally tease this episode happening, or more blatantly, outright say that no matchups were ever guaranteed to happen just because they said they would do it. Nevertheless, some of that hardcore audience still persisted, even going as far to have this episode being advertised as the #1 most requested death battle of all time. Ignore the part where they said Sora vs. Pit had more requests in the Road to 100 blog. Like with Frieza vs. Megatron, Galactus vs. Unicron was planned for Season 8 as its season finale, which makes perfect sense given that it was a season to celebrate the show's history. But the episode had to be delayed because... why do you think? And this was also the reason why we never got to see Rooster Teeth's in-house 3D team, aside from Torian, in any episodes since Red vs. Blue. While some of them did help out with other episodes from time to time, that was only if they were working under Death Battle specifically. Though, with all that said, it is good to know that they were able to finish this episode before Rooster Teeth's closure, but let's see if I think that 8-year wait was worth it. The analyses have a running question of, what is evil? This was used to transition into how Galen became Galactus. Eventually, they described Galactus as a being of energy, or the power cosmic in this case, with no soul. Meaning,
I am the power cosmic incarnate, not so easily felled.
The moment he became Galactus was the moment he lost his humanity, or whatever his planet's equivalent of that is called. And then they start to cover the power cosmic itself in a much better way than they did in Norin's rundown. They dedicate multiple paragraphs to covering the extent of the power cosmic instead of just casually dropping one sentence about it and expecting you to know the rest. And then this leads into some dummy bullying in the cutaway gag, and a weird bit about how Boomstick sees everyone as beer cans. I feel like this is retconning something. Why is he saying this now? And since when has he seen Wiz as a beer can? Either way, I think that it's truly cringeworthy even for cutaway standards. Though once that ends, Wiz starts diving into how Galactus is bound by his hunger, comparing it to how humans are bound to eating plants and animals for survival, where it's not out of hatred, it's not out of vengeance, it's out of necessity, meaning that when they describe him as a force of nature, they're subtly asking the question of whether he's more of a force or more of nature. And they also treat this conflict as a means of scaling him to or above the strongest in all of Marvel, baby. Their words, not mine. Like that time he fought Scryer, or the time he challenged the might of Odin, or the Phoenix Force, or the time that he one-shot Darkseid. What the fuck? You can't just have that there and then not elaborate. Like, what? I really like this pacing. It's another one of those subtle ways Death Battle is able to demonstrate critical analysis of someone's story. Obviously, the stories that feature those characters are going to be much more compelling than Death Battle is ever going to make them sound, but speaking as someone who firmly believes that power scaling can be something that beautifully supports the story's themes, even if it supposedly goes against the author's intent, this, and many other examples from Season 10 now that I'm thinking about it, are prime ways to do it. I also bring up other examples from Season 10 because I think it's done a little worse here. Just because the humor is fairly overbearing at first, albeit not to the same extent as Dragonborn's, Cole's, or Megatron's, but Wiz's philosophical questions often feel like they're fighting for attention over Boomstick's quirky one-liners and nicknames. The Happy Meal toy bit is one thing because look at that ultimate nullifier, though I do think the joke should have ended after that instead of another corny sentence, but the beginning has references to Grandpappy Boomstick and nicknames like G-Dog. It's fine to poke fun at the source material for any bizarre writing choices, which is exactly what they do later on, but I don't need random jokes taking up the space of whatever needs more attention. But then again, this is also one of the rare cases where the editing does more undermining than the writing, just because I think some of the edits in the beginning are a bit too comical and kind of limp for my liking, such as hearing a funny scream during this rocket edit and a stock eating sound effect with no image or animation of something being eaten. But the bigger sin is that the editing is just lazy. Even if this was an episode edited by Gerardo meant for Season 8, he still made much more creative and engaging edits than just basic comic panels being pushed on the screen, or other comic panels and clips popping on screen with no effects or transitions that also aren't timed with the music or the dialogue. But still, I really like how it ends, and it generally overshadows this issue for me, with this shot of Galactus staring at the moon that features Galen as if he's reflecting on his past, and Wiz's ending note on how the true evil was the slow death of Galen's humanity, ending it on this question.
What could be more terrifying than a being that sees everything and everyone you know and love as nothing more than his next meal?
And that, braggers, is where the next section comes in.
This episode of Death Battle is sponsored by BetterHelp.
Okay, that's kind of a good point. Unicron's analysis seeks to answer that question properly. They start by saying how Unicron wanted to consume everything and how the One was forced to split it into two entities, with the Unicron in question consisting of chaos, and at no point do they imply that she's it is even a character. Wiz refers to Unicron as the physical embodiment of death and destruction, and Boomstick simplifies it with the label of Robot Satan, which by the way was the sole reason why this episode was represented by a pentagram of all things. The arsenal and abilities also get covered in a similar light, whether it's referring to his weapons as unholy or saying how some of his powers can corrupt other beings. And then they reference Unicron's unkillable nature, or at least how he's unable to die through conventional means, stating how Unicron is resurrected in a new universe following every death. And this leads into a really nice and subtle way of saying that they're fully compositing Unicron. They then cover how its very existence distorts not just all of space-time, but it can drive civilizations to insanity. Just as goodness is incomprehensible to Unicron, Unicron's evil nature is inconceivable to us humans. No one can fathom how evil they are, except for Orson Welles, apparently. Yeah, I like this cutaway gag. It's a fun reference to an outtake for one of his commercials, where it highlights the irony of Unicron being voiced by someone like Orson Welles, while still displaying admiration for one of the most important people in all of theater. The rest of the analysis covers why Unicron is such an iconic villain and what it symbolizes, meaning this.
Every petty act of violence, every war, every cruelty, every death battle gives Unicron life, the life he'll use to kill us all. We are culpable in our own annihilation.
And then to my surprise, even Boomstick gets some prose in there, ending with this last line.
He's as inevitable as your dying breath.
Jesus, now you got me scared.
Heat! That is heat! And no, Wiz's last line doesn't break my immersion. If anything, that felt like an accidental inclusion from Ben Singer, because Chad's delivery really was that good. That was earned. And unlike with Galactus, Unicron's rundown has only one joke from Boomstick outside of the cutaway gag, and it's at the beginning, thus making this one of the most immersive analyses in the entire show for me, legitimately getting me excited for the fight that we've all been waiting for. Alright, let's get the most obvious thing out of the way. This is the best looking 3D episode of the show. Not the most cinematic, that still goes to Sauron vs. the Lich King in my eyes, but going off of the visuals alone, this one is better. Look at the orange lighting from the opening shots. Look at the space battleground. Look at the other planets. Look at the galaxy. Wait, is that a galaxy chucker? Look at the VFX. Look at this black hole-like thing. I don't know what that is, but it looks beautiful, so I like it. And look at these character models. Galactus' model is from Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but I'd argue that it's composited and lit better than it was in its source game. In MVC 3, it shared the same issue as many other models from that game, where the high contrast filter makes the body shadows feel too exaggerated, and it never hides the fact that the models are low poly. But here, the filters make Galactus look much better. Look at the lighting in his eyes, his helmet, and his chest piece. They look like the eyes that would loom over the shadows of where no one can hear you scream. Plus, the expression work is much more varied, the shading on his getup looks better, and the funny full body beam looks really good too. But Unicron's model, however, is custom made. I've heard that it's based on the HasLab model, but the fact that it was still custom made is impressive. The textures do look a little flat at points, but the lights pop and the animations still look very mechanical and robotic. And there's also this drawn-out transformation scene with pretty good sound design, though all of the visuals pale in comparison to the best thing about this fight, the cosmic scale. I've heard plenty of people say that this is what Thanos vs. Darkseid should have been, and I agree. They start off at planet level because, no duh, they have to, but then they end up manipulating and even destroying stars, and then they grow outside of the galaxies they're fighting in, then their strikes casually shake the cosmos and snuff out universes, and then there's the most brilliant use of the cosmic scale in this fight, and that takes place during the Ultimate Nullifier scene. See, you might have noticed that the fight was in letterboxes. You'd think that this was just to make the fight look more cinematic and cool, but actually, even if it's the Ultimate Nullifier doing this, it stretches beyond the letterboxes and warps the scenery. And it even does that when Galactus breaks out of his pocket dimension. This is symbolic for their incomprehensible scale, and it fits perfectly with how Liam wrote the fight less as what they directly do to celestial bodies, and more what happens as a byproduct of the fight. That's a perfect concept for these two, and it's wonderfully handled. Though, they still have them directly weaponizing celestial bodies. And while it's usually for telekinesis, you have Unicron crushing a sun into a black hole, and even a universe to power up its attacks. Literally in the case where it, transforming. Okay, that line of dialogue was pretty cringy, not gonna lie, Liam. But trust me, the cosmic scale is so perfect that even the sound design can't keep up with it. There's also this part where Galactus says a line while the backing track is singing its lyrics, and without any lip syncing to boot.
I have no patience left.
Was this part not meant to have dialogue or something? And while Wolf Williams does a fantastic Galactus and Brent Mukai does a pretty good Unicron, their audio filters can get overbearing at times. It didn't really bother me that much, but I can see how it would for other people. Though, since I brought up the voices, I have heard that Unicron's characterization is a shockingly contentious talking point about this episode. I've heard that it was mischaracterized. I've heard that it wasn't. I've heard that this is a moot point because Unicron is supposed to be a full composite which features Unicrons that do talk a lot. I've also heard the interpretation that it's saying a lot because this is a Unicron fighting someone on its level. I've also heard that this interpretation isn't legit. Though, in general, I feel like the whole Unicron doesn't monologue criticism is kind of weird to me because I'm pretty sure that one of the most iconic things in all of Transformers is literally a monologue from Unicron. Or at the very least, what else would you call this?
Considered sparing your wretched little planet, Cybertron. Now you shall witness its dismemberment.
But nevertheless, I do know that the iambic pentameter structure is a nod to Orson Welles' On Shakespeare, which is a book compiling his theater history. He was a huge fan of Shakespeare's works in particular, and if I remember correctly, Welles was casted as Unicron because of the irony of a world devourer being voiced by someone who loved life and its art. So seeing all of that being represented in the fight is a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one to me. However, there is an issue that I consider majorly prevalent, and it isn't quite pertaining to characterization, though you could argue that it is. Remember when the analyses had an overarching philosophical discussion of what is evil, and subtly hyping up Galactus as the lesser of the two evils? Yeah, the fight fails to give it a proper payoff. The most you can say is that Unicron is devouring and weaponizing more planets and universes than Galactus, but in terms of the lesser of the two evils idea, which is also the most interesting theme of this entire matchup, mind you, they're both presented on a similar level of evil. Galactus' characterization, while I've heard is accurate to the comics sort of contradicts how his analysis describes him. While he's definitely a villain, I'm not trying to imply otherwise, he seems more tragic, or at least nuanced than that. Look, I don't need to have Galactus directly seeing Unicron as the bigger evil, as that'd be stretching a little too far into the whole, no, this is not what I want territory. And I do think this idea does come into some level of play, at least with the first line referencing the force of nature aspect about him, but I feel like the audience could have benefited from seeing more implications like that, such as Galactus consuming planets for more power as a last resort, or at least looking more reluctant about it, to contrast Unicron doing it nonchalantly and constantly, or maybe having Galactus using less telekinesis on the planets in the beginning and saving it for the later parts of the fight. After all, wasn't the idea supposed to be more akin to how they're affecting the cosmos around them? But with that said, there are other parts of the dialogue that do a decent job implying it at first. Galactus begins by describing himself as an obligatory force of nature, while Unicron just glides towards the planet without saying a word. And then there's this part where Galactus criticizes Unicron for succumbing to the madness conveyed by his actions.
Madness, so quick to pay for oblivion's embrace.
All of this is good stuff, but that's sadly the most we get from this contrast, as the rest of Galactus' side of the script is basic boasting. The English major in me adores the poetic structure of the dialogue, but a lot of it here feels like flowery language with no real substance. When Unicron says that gods will fall before his power, Galactus' response is more that they'll both bring destruction to the world, which I think comes across as a different intent than what Liam may have been wanting to include. Sure, it implies that Galactus is referring to himself as a god, which makes sense here, but it feels like a generic non sequitur. I feel like this season has done much better jobs at being cohesive with the analyses, like in Dovahkiin vs. Chosen Undead, Stitch vs. Rocket, Cole vs. Alex, Scooby vs. Courage, Guts vs. Dimitri, etc, etc. And I also think that the action is a little too samey, but I don't know if I can call it wasted potential either, since we do see more interesting powers like matter manipulation and Galactus escaping into and breaking out of a pocket dimension. And given that this is Galactus versus the concept of chaos, I would argue that the death consists of conceptual erasure, but a lot of it is just punching and laser beams, like Galactus does the full body beam twice, mainly because Liam thought it was funny, which is fair, but it also features this confusing shot of Unicron slicing Galactus in half, yet you can barely see it on screen for very long, and the ending starts off interesting with Unicron possessing the ultimate nullifier, which technically contradicts the conclusion and how it can't even do that to the nullifier, but Liam fully admits that he was taking creative liberties here because the nullifier is such a boring win condition, so okay, fair enough. Plus, you could still make a case that the episode was portraying how Galactus arguably didn't even need it to win. Even though the ultimate nullifier was a big factor in the conclusion, they still said that it ultimately came down to who was more powerful, so it's fine to represent that in some way. However, that is not a defense for the rushed death. Unicron's death scream is hard to hear, the beams that vaporize it look less impressive and powerful than the full body beam, and the ending shot doesn't linger long enough. 2 years worth of delays, yet the ending felt rushed. If nothing else, it at least means that it really did take this animation 2 years to render. This is the type of animation that'll make you stop breathing in more ways than one. Though since I brought up the conclusion, the rest of it is pretty good. It covers the factors pretty well, and I didn't know that Kamen Rider and Mortal Kombat were connected to the Marvel multiverse. Wait, this is fan art? I know that this was eventually cleared up, but with all due respect, how did this even slip by? Did nobody fact check this? I know for a fact that there are stock multiverse images you could have used. Why was this one picked out of all of them? Dingus is at Death Battle? Yeah, this guy gets it. But other than that, I don't have too much to say. Good logic, well-presented research, something started small and ended big, but overall, I feel like I was slightly disappointed by this. I know that living up to an 8-year waiting period is a Herculean feat that not even Sun Wukong could overcome, so that might be my fault for setting my expectations a little high, but this episode was directly advertised as the most requested death battle of all time, and even the episode itself, on multiple occasions, hyped it up as the fight you, the viewer, have been waiting for this whole time. It set me up for something that feels like the episode for me, who was around during this episode's entire waiting period, but it felt like a script that felt a little out of date in comparison to the sum of its parts. Even Frostathan, while a worse episode in my opinion, felt like its fight stood strong alongside its contemporaries even if its analyses didn't. But let me say it again, slightly. In spite of my problems with some of the dialogue, the writing is generally ingenious, especially in the analyses, and the writing in the fight isn't bad at all. It just needed less flowers and more soil, but those flowers were still pretty and ripe. It left a lot to live up to, and to some it was worth the wait. But subjectively speaking, for me, it's very flawed, but still great. 85 out of 100, an oddly optimistic fate, but it's the best Transformers episode that Death Battle could create. I reckon that some people would have preferred me to give it a higher score, but if you look at my ranking of this season, it really is that stacked. I've seen people act surprised to see Death Battle being almost unanimously praised, knowing the constant controversy and arguments that it drummed up. And yeah, it's a surprise, but I feel like it's more nuanced than you might think. Back then, most people didn't make content reviewing each individual episode. The only adjacent videos you would see were reactions to the episodes and the debunked videos, which internalized the rhetoric that Death Battle is bad at research. And let's not sugarcoat it, those claims had at least some weight to them, but the climate at the time heavily implied that if one thing of a product is bad, everything about it is bad, with no redeeming qualities. Being a legitimate fan of the show was pretty hard. Why do you think it took me 11 years to consider myself a part of the Death Battle community? And while the show is considered better research now than it was back then, what people haven't been considering is that classic Death Battle always had good and even great episodes in spite of the research. And not all of the research in those episodes were as bad as people made them out to be, but they all kept getting overshadowed by all the salt and sand that was filling up everyone's bias. For instance, Tony vs. Lex and Snake vs. Sam stopped receiving praise because Yang vs. Tifa would happen later in the year. No one wanted to talk about how good Dante vs. Bayonetta or Ryu vs. Jin were because too many people disagreed with the outcome. And episodes like Ratchet and Clank vs. Jack and Daxter and Ken vs. Terry went largely ignored because they were in the same season as Bowser vs. Ganondorf and Tracer vs. Scout. Hell, Season 6 in general was overlooked and underappreciated for years just because of Ben 10 vs. Green Lantern, and to an extent Sasuke vs. Hiei. But ever since Season 8, Death Battle fans have become more vocal. Whether that's overall good or bad thing is up to you, but the likes of Biffweed, Raptor, Nemesis Bloodreich, and more have been building larger audiences with the amount of Death Battle videos that sometimes elicit more interesting conversations. And this in turn inspired other YouTubers to make Death Battle content that also developed their own audience, and people within those audiences would start to develop a more interesting take on Death Battle itself. And on top of that, Death Battle debunked videos started getting less popular, and even the people who make them mostly acted less hostile with less snark and sarcasm. All of these factors improved the show's reputation across the internet, and now we can talk about how good the animations are and gush about our favorite episodes of each season. Sure, it still has people who don't care for the show anyway, and there's especially the occasional terminally online hater, but that's gonna happen in any big fandom. And I feel like the criticism that the show gets is more reasonable, or at least more civil, barring any discussions of power scaling discourse and passionate Madara versus Aizen haters that randomly feel like developing a fetish for spewing slurs on the regular. Like, that one I really don't get. Using slurs isn't even that cool of a thing to do, but still, the fact that we're at a point where this is what I consider to be in the bottom half of Season 10 should be pretty telling as to how good it feels to be a Death Battle fan. And now, as we enter a new era of Death Battle, I feel like that hype is only gonna grow more and more. Once again, this season was the best time to be a Death Battle fan, and I expect it to stay that way for quite a while. But enough of that for right now. Let's cap off this whole retrospective by ranking every single Death Battle we've talked about over the course of this year. Justin Bieber versus Rebecca Black, Ragna versus Soul, Mewtwo versus Shadow, Rogue versus Wonder Woman, Starscream versus Rainbow Dash, Ivy versus Orchid, Blake versus Mikasa, Cammy versus Sonya, Metal Sonic versus Zero, Fulgore versus Sector, Venom versus Bane, Gaara versus Toph, Venom versus Krona, Chun-Li versus Mai Shiranui, Jotaro versus Kenshiro, Bowser versus Ganondorf, Batman versus Captain America, Aang versus Edward, Thanos versus Darkseid, Danny Phantom versus Jake Long, Beast versus Goliath, Goku versus Superman 2015, Sanji versus Rock Lee, Deku versus Asta, Lucario versus Renamon, Batgirl versus Spider-Gwen, Yang versus Tifa, Black Canary versus Sindel,
Lindari Sweet, baby!
Luke Skywalker versus Harry Potter, Raven versus Twilight Sparkle, Tracer versus Scout, Sub-Zero versus Glacius, Luigi versus Tails, Darth Vader versus Doctor Doom, Black Panther versus Batman, Boba Fett versus Predator, Bomberman versus Dig Dug, Korra versus Storm, Amy versus Ramona, Mario versus Sonic 2018, Phoenix versus Raven, Gray versus Esdeath, Akuma versus Shao Kahn, Batman Beyond versus Spider-Man 2099, Lara Croft versus Nathan Drake, Scrooge McDuck versus Shovel Knight, Zuko versus Shoto, Gogeta versus Vegito, Deadpool versus Pinkie Pie, She-Ra versus Wonder Woman, Zitz versus Leonardo, Android 18 versus Captain Marvel, Link versus Cloud, Nightwing versus Daredevil, Guts versus Nightmare, Felicia versus Tao Kaka, Boba Fett versus Samus, Pikachu versus Blanca, Flash versus Quicksilver, Green Arrow versus Hawkeye, Yoshi versus Riptor, Naruto versus Ichigo, Shadow versus Ryuko, Fox versus Bucky O'Hare, Sora versus Pit, Hagar versus Zangief, Master Chief versus Doomguy, Macho Man versus Kool-Aid Man, Thor versus Wonder Woman, Chosen Undead versus Dovahkiin, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Battle Royale, Black Adam versus Apocalypse, Natsu vs. Ace, Jason Voorhees vs. Michael Myers, You Blithering Punks, Boba Fett vs. Samus 2015, Wally West vs. Archie Sonic, Batman vs. Spider-Man, Vegeta vs. Shadow, Ghost Rider vs. Lobo, Captain Marvel vs. Shazam, Genos vs. War Machine, Shao Kahn vs. M. Bison, Heihachi Mishima vs. Geese Howard, SpongeBob vs. Super Friends Aquaman, Akuma vs. Shang Tsung, Carnage vs. Lucy, Doctor Strange vs. Dr. Fate, Kratos vs. Spawn, Batman vs. Iron Man, Peach vs. Zelda, White Tiger Zord vs. Gundam Epion, Steven Universe vs. Star Butterfly, Ben 10 vs. Green Lantern, Thor vs. Vegeta, Terminator vs. RoboCop, Hercules vs. Sun Wukong, Lex Luthor vs. Dr. Doom, Sasuke vs. Hiei, Goomba vs. Koopa, Smokey Bear vs. McGruff the Crime Dog, Red vs. Blue, Weiss vs. Mitsuru, Hulk vs. Doomsday, Scarlet Witch vs. Zatanna, Charizard vs. Agumon, Zoro vs. Erza, Thor vs. Raiden, Crash vs. Spyro, Killua vs. Misaka, The Meta vs. Carolina, James Bond vs. John Wick,
Penis metaphor!
Kirby vs. Majin Buu, Aquaman vs. Namor, Tanjiro vs. yours truly, Sephiroth vs. Virgil, Hulk vs. Broly, Godzilla vs. Gamera, Optimus Prime vs. Gundam, Joker vs. Sweet Tooth, Mario vs. Sonic, Roshi vs. Jiraiya, Beerus vs. Sailor Galaxia, Madara vs. Aizen, Wario vs. King DDD, Ken vs. Terry, Dr. Eggman vs. Dr. Wily, Ant-Man vs. the Atom, He-Man vs. Lion-O, Omni-Man vs. Homelander, Saberwolf vs. John Talbane, Black Widow vs. Widowmaker, Darth Vader vs. Obito, Galactus vs. Unicron, Goro vs. Machamp, Chuck Norris vs. Segata Sanshiro, Power Rangers vs. Voltron, Martian Manhunter vs. Silver Surfer, Miles Morales vs. Static, Cole vs. Alex, Leon Kennedy vs. Frank West, Dragonzord vs. Mecha Godzilla, Wolverine vs. Raiden, Ryu vs. Scorpion, Mega Man vs. Astro Boy, Mob vs. Tatsumaki, Donkey Kong vs. Knuckles, Leonardo vs. Jason, Stitch vs. Rocket Raccoon, Obi-Wan vs. Kakashi, Goku vs. Superman 2023, Yoda vs. King Mickey, Winter Soldier vs. Red Hood, Gojo vs. Makima, the Pokemon Battle Royale, Shredder vs. Silver Samurai, Harley Quinn vs. Jinx, Goku Black vs. Reverse Flash, the Mega Man Battle Royale, Hercule Satan vs. Dan Hibiki, Trunks vs. Silver, Iron Fist vs. Poe, Ultron vs. Sigma, Ryu Hayabusa vs. Strider Hiryu, Ratchet and Clank vs. Jack and Daxter, Goku vs. Superman, Link vs. Cloud 2021, Snake vs. Sam, Saitama vs. Popeye, Cable vs. Booster Gold, the Booster Goat, Deadpool vs. Deathstroke, All Might vs. Might Guy, Iron Man vs. Lex Luthor, Ryu vs. Jin, Ganondorf vs. Dracula, Bill Cipher vs. Discord, Magneto vs. Tetsuo, Dio vs. Alucard, Scooby Doo vs. Courage the Cowardly Dog, Johnny Cage vs. Captain Falcon, Dante vs. Bayonetta, Rick Sanchez vs. the Doctor, Balrog vs. TJ Combo, Sauron vs. Lich King, Samurai Jack vs. Afro Samurai, and finally, Guts vs. Dimitri Alexandra Blavin. This conclusion was written before Death Battle announced their independency and recorded before Omni-Man vs. Bardock. Speaking of which... By the time you reach this part of the video, I've already made a community post explaining the future of this channel and what I'm gonna do with my content going forward. Go read it if you want to know everything I have to say, but the short version, I will not be reviewing any future death battles for a very long time. As much fun as I've had revisiting this show, I want to move on to other kinds of content, most notably fighting game music analysis. So yeah, subscribe and join my membership program to keep in touch with all that. But given that this video came out after Omni-Man vs. Bardock, I feel like I at least owe you guys this, though don't expect a score. This is more of a first impressions rather than a proper review, as I'm recording this only a few hours after the episode aired, so I don't really have any bullet points to look off of. I'm just going off of my vague memory, but I'll try to make them as coherent as possible. Omni-Man's analysis kinda disappointed me. I wouldn't call it bad, especially since the editing is better than ever before. Hiding spoilers in his first episode is completely understandable. I was hoping that they would at least allude to what happened in his final days, and you can imagine my disappointment. I do respect at least the ending trying to focus on his fatherhood. I personally thought his first analysis low-key did it at least a little better, rather than just being shoehorned at the end. And aside from that, a lot of it is just a respect thread of things that we already heard about. Bardock's analysis, however, no joke, this is probably my favorite Dragon Ball analysis ever. And I'm not just saying that because there's a lot of new feats that we would never have gotten to see in any other Saiyan analysis, but I really like how they handle the stuff about Super Saiyan. Not only do they say what it stems from, but also say that Bardock's Super Saiyan form, despite the power-up arguably being a what-if scenario, made it feel like he earned it spiritually, and that's so cool. Oh, and also they talk about Big Monkey. I like Big Monkey. And the fight? It's good. It's nothing super special or anything, but for its indie debut, I think it's enjoyable enough. A lot of it does feel like standard fare though. You know, Dragon Ball Ki Blast, flying superhero action, etc, etc. And there's a moment where Nolan throws Bardock's pod that could have been awesome, but instead it looks like Bardock just stands still for no reason. Not even trying to defend himself, really. But where Bardock does get to shine is in the transformations. The Big Ape one is pretty good, and I like the line that Bardock uses to go into it. But the Super Saiyan transformation is amazing. Bardock's line is even better, and I especially like how the music aligns with it. Solid State Invincible goes hard, by the way. And despite losing, the Super Saiyan form doesn't exactly get jobbered, even if the most he does is his level 3 from the most overrated fighting game of all time. Wait, who said that? And then there's the kill, and it's a lot like Dragonborn vs. Chosen Undead for me, where as much as I really like what comes after the death, the actual killing blow is really bad. He pops Bardock's arm. Is that really it? This is an invincible character, and this is the goriest you could do? Something tells me this fight should have been in sprites or something. But like I said, what happens after the kill is really good. See, Omni-Man had this whole thing of not giving a shit about Bardock or his race to a point where he didn't even bother knowing what it was. But then Omni-Man screams out the name Saiyan, and Bardock recognizes it as him ultimately coming to respect him. And then we get to this shot of Omni-Man all bloodied and beaten up, and then he just lets out a single word. I'm not sure if this is supposed to be him disappointed in killing Bardock, but I also feel like this scene is open to interpretation. In fact, with Tom Shock returning as Omni-Man, I feel like he's done an even better job here. Not just with his delivery of Saiyan, where he basically summons his inner J.K. Simmons at that point, but also with the first line he says, indicating that this is a new Omni-Man. And Comrade Nikad's Bardock is, I mean, it's alright. I like his battle cries, but the actual words is kind of weird. And seeing him boasting about how Goku could beat Mark's ass made me laugh out loud, and I don't think they wanted me to do that. However, there's the conclusion. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. This has some of the most ridiculous research of any Death Battle episode I've seen. Even if some of it goes into outside factors, the episode is technically wrong by the episode's logic, or at least debatably. I've already started seeing comparisons to Ben 10 vs. Green Lantern, and personally, I'd argue it's infinitely more similar to Sasuke vs. Hiei, but I digress. In the episode, they admit that Bardock has a speed advantage, but Nolan is more powerful and more experienced. They say out loud that Omni-Man is 11,000 times more powerful than base Bardock. And even if the gap becomes thinner over time, that still shouldn't make Nolan any more than 350 times stronger than Bardock. Sounds like a hard-fought victory on paper, right? But remember that speed advantage I mentioned earlier? If you take a look at their maximum potential, they put Bardock at over 23,000 times faster than Nolan, meaning that the speed gap is twice as big as what they describe as the power gap for how much more powerful Nolan is above Bardock in his base form. So going off of the episode's own logic, I fail to see why Bardock wouldn't just blitz Nolan. But to be fair, there are black boxes that make the power gap a little higher and where Nolan's speed is much closer to Bardock's. But like I said, there are outside factors to consider here. I'm not gonna go into them in this video. I'm sure that other people are gonna do that anyway in comments that I'm just gonna be ignoring. Although shoutouts to all my subscribers and viewers keeping it civil with the debate related stuff in the comments of the community post I made about this episode. If you were a part of that convo and you didn't get angry or toxic, give yourself some bragging rights in the comments. And I'm especially not ready to discuss the debate between the next episode, Joker versus Giorno. No matter who wins, Discord is gonna get involved and not in the way even he wants to. But you know what? I don't think I'm gonna be impacted by any salt. Because at the end of the day, we're just having fun. Some people are exclusively gonna be looking at it from a power scaling standpoint. I can't stop them from doing that. Because at the end of the day, this is a versus show. But what made people like me stick around for so long is that Death Battle consciously chooses to be much more than that. And if you don't believe me, then I invite you to take another look at what I've said about every episode from Death Battle's first 10 seasons. I'd argue there's a lot to learn from Death Battle. A lot more than you might think. So yeah, in case you couldn't tell, I think Death Battle is a pretty good show. It's far from the atrocity of humanity that some people randomly feel like gaslighting others into thinking, but it's also not this grandstanding, innovative masterpiece that I randomly felt like gassing it up to be. It's a show you either watch mature like a fine wine or cheese, or a show you ditched the moment it became a bad curry meal. Not everyone likes to witness someone else's awkward growth after all, but one reason it meant so much to me is that I was going through a bit of an awkward growth myself. Several, actually, with one instance coming from working on this retrospective retrospective series. And I think that's why so many others have stuck around with this dumb show for so long. And the way Death Battle goes about it feels artistic in its own way. This is absolutely gonna sound corny to some people, and I get it, but you know what they say about fiction and interpretation. There's always something ultimately necessary in pushing through that growth. A good fight, a bangin' soundtrack, a video showcasing a unique take on one of your all-time favorite characters and series. But is that it? Yeah, actually. Sometimes the smaller accomplishments deserve massive celebrations too, and once you realize what the Death Battle team members have gone through and felt when working on the show, where it's not always easy to see this kind of information from most shows of similar and bigger sizes, the embarrassment starts to be framed in a different light. I've learned that it doesn't hold us back forever, and with that, I guess they took a lot more inspiration from Monty than I thought they did. See this tribute right here? I originally used it as B-roll that I was eventually gonna delete once I didn't need it anymore, but I decided to keep a hold on it anyway, and it's mainly because this thing always stuck out to me.
Moving forward is, I always think about what's next. So like, I'm super excited to finish what we have so that I can just start working on something else.
I forever struggle to understand why this sentence meant so much to me. What if there is no next one? What if things are cut shorter than we want them to be? Well, as Monty said before, the only thing that stops us from doing cool things is time. And time hasn't always been kind to Death Battle in their eras, whether it's them starting out, going through changes, or even now with Rooster Teeth being shut down. But it's classically said that our stories will outlive us. They're more important than our lives, and rest assured, there are lots of stories that have been told and even more that have yet to be told. But what most people don't seem to acknowledge is that any story can resonate with anyone for better or for worse. But let me just say right now that it's infinitely better to remember the better and the worse equally, rather than cater to the side that sounds better to you. That's how you make stories that really leave an impact on people. And as for me, well, never thought I'd get to end another era this soon, but I'm guessing that this is a part of life's many unwavering convictions. Whatever ends up happening with Death Battle, I hope that the people who worked on it are able to not only start their next era, but to find their next story and conquer the time they have with it. All they really have to do is just give it a go. That is how Death Battle came into existence after all. But until then, here's to 10 seasons of Death Battle, to whatever path they end up taking, and to where it will lead them. No moss will slow us down.
But, oh yeah, and Speedy, also tell me the difference, if there's any difference between Fanta and Crush, or like, there's another type of colored soda, or should I say soda's a color? I don't fucking know. like Fanta and Crush, similar brands, I guess. If there's a difference between any of them. Because I know... Oh, and this is not the researcher Speedy. I'm talking to like the Speedy from Red Runner's channel. I need to know his opinion on this type of thing. That just be very worthwhile. But the Fanta just being very similar to something very similar to Crush, I guess. I'm very tired right now, so make like Samuel L. Jackson and like, can you even see my eyes? Do I got like a 1,000-yard stare with like Jotaro? Like, here. Look at this. Look at this. Look at my 1,000-yard stare here.
If a watering can doesn't work like it should, then it would be called a watering can't.
Do I have any other funny thing to say? Or should I just put this onto the way up? I got nothing funny. Yeah. By the way, I know you can see the camera in this shot, but it's 1 a.m. over here, and I've also been working since, like, fucking 10 a.m. on this video alone. So, like, fuck off, fuck you, leave me alone.